Dark, menacing faces leered down with cruel, twisted grins, surrounding their target with relentless, degrading chants. Driven to the ground by their relentless cruelty, he curls into a tight ball as his tormentors stand over him, repeating the vicious insults without pause. Trapped beneath the crowd, he remains helpless on the floor while the malicious tormentors encircle his trembling body. As if the verbal abuse were not enough, he suffers further humiliation as icy water is poured over him in the restroom, drenching his body while the echoes insist this torment will never end. Though he desperately wishes for an escape, he is forced to endure the daily reality of being singled out and degraded simply for who he is. Even returning to his desk offers no sanctuary, as he finds his workspace vandalized with vile scribbles and garbage while his classmates laugh mockingly around him. Forced onto his knees in front of the entire classroom, he stares down at a mound of food waste dumped onto the floor, while the surrounding students order him to eat it like an animal. When he stammers in protest, declaring that he cannot bring himself to consume the trash, a heavy fist violently strikes his face, sending blood splattering as he recoils from the impact. Towering over his bleeding victim, the lead bully Ryokanzuna ruthlessly demands total obedience, while Kamada and Yuro join in with cruel laughter, delighting in his helplessness. He lay helpless as female classmates gathered to taunt him, questioning whether he was even capable of swallowing the food dumped on the floor. Nearby, other students cupped their hands around their mouths, shouting insults and derisively branding him a pig to spur on the cruelty. As another boy stuffed his face while watching the spectacle, the tormentors framed the humiliation as a challenge, demanding that he hurry up. The ringleaders stared down at him with ruthless intensity, coldly demanding to know if he truly intended to let the food go to waste. Overcome by pressure and despair, he surrendered, lowering his face directly to the dirty floor to force down the scattered food. The entire classroom erupted into mocking laughter and cheers, delighted by the pathetic sight of his utter capitulation. A hand yanked him forcefully by the hair to lift his tear-stained face, while a classmate brandished a smartphone, eager to capture a commemorative photo. The crowd gathered behind him, posing with gleeful smiles as the bright flash illuminated his complete degradation. The onlookers gleefully brainstormed cruel captions for the photograph, eagerly plotting to place the humiliating picture into the official graduation yearbook. Looking back on those days, existing in such a relentless environment was nothing short of a living nightmare. He had finally reached his limit, standing near the quiet railway crossing on that fateful afternoon, ready to end all his suffering. As the blinding headlight of an oncoming train rushed directly toward him, he closed his eyes and braced for the impending impact. Instead of destruction, he opened his eyes to find himself miraculously alive, transported to a serene, sunlit landscape alongside a clear river. Adapting to his peaceful new routine, he effortlessly speared a large fish from the water, smiling with satisfaction at his fresh catch. Stretching under the warm, clear sky, he relished the peaceful outdoor air, deeply grateful for another gentle day in this unfamiliar world. Suddenly, the calm atmosphere shifted as massive, pig-faced humanoid beasts stepped out from the tree-line, locking their fierce gazes onto him. Yet far from threatening him, one of the creatures called out in friendly anticipation of dinner, to which he warmly responded as he gathered his catch. Walking back alongside them, he reflected on the moment he first arrived in this realm after being engulfed by the bright flash of the train. Looking at the tribe of orcs gathered before him, he marveled at how their formidable appearances belied their peaceful nature. He remembered how, during those initial terrifying moments in the forest, he had fully expected to meet a gruesome death at their hands. He had spent 6 months living alongside the village inhabitants, finding a genuine sense of belonging among them. Holding a cheerful little creature in his arms, he realized with a warm smile that his own broad features had likely led them to accept him as one of their own from the very start. As the tiny creature squealed happily, he praised its efforts, enjoying these simple, heartwarming daily interactions. When mealtime arrived, the villagers called out to him warmly, inviting him to join their shared gathering. Around the evening campfire, surrounded by music, laughter, and shared food, he felt a deep sense of fulfillment despite their humble surroundings. Looking up at the brilliant star-filled sky above the peaceful settlement, He marveled that such a serene existence could truly be his. Suddenly, a familiar voice called out his name from a distance, making his chest swell with sudden emotion as he turned toward the sound. Running toward him with a radiant smile and waving enthusiastically was Corellia, bringing a warmth that instantly brightened his world. As she approached and gently took his hand into hers, his heart pounded violently against his ribs. Sitting beside her in the quiet beauty of nature, a profound truth settled over him. For the very first time in his life, he had fallen in love. He noticed a gentle similarity in Corellia that instantly brought his younger sister, Bunna, to mind. Blushing awkwardly at his sudden distraction, he stammered a hasty apology to her. That fleeting thought plunged him back into a painful memory of the person most special to him. Sirens had blared through the night as a devastating fire engulfed a home, casting horrifying flames against the dark sky while a helpless crowd watched in shock. Overcome by desperate panic, he had charged headlong toward the inferno, screaming his sister's name into the smoke and heat. Tears had streamed down his face as he desperately searched for any sign of her within the blazing destruction. Returning to the present, he felt a soft touch snap him out of his tragic reverie as Corellia offered him a beautiful glass pinned and attached to a braided cord. Deeply moved, he accepted the keepsake, quietly murmuring her name in gratitude. As the afternoon sun began to set over the rolling fields, the two shared a warm farewell, waving to one another with promises to meet again soon. He stood quietly in the tall grass, watching her figure gradually recede down the path until she disappeared into the distant horizon. Pondering their friendship, he wryly mused that elves were said to dislike humans, wondering if she treated him so kindly simply because his unique appearance didn't register as human to her. Moments later, he walked into the heart of the village, greeted on all sides by the towering, friendly faces of his orc companions. Accepting a freshly hunted bird from one of the hunters, he realized how ironic it was that he had found a truly human way of living only after leaving human society behind. Gathering around the evening fire with his new family, he cheerfully agreed to prepare a hearty stew, thoroughly content in the warmth of their shared meal. He smiled warmly surrounded by his friendly companions, quietly reflecting on how much he treasured these peaceful days, unaware that this newfound tranquility was on the verge of being shattered. The fragile peace that Takashi had found was shattered in an instant, leaving him standing frozen amidst the burning wreckage of the settlement. Flames roared through the destroyed homes, engulfing the slaughtered bodies scattered across the scorched earth in a matter of seconds. His eyes widened in utter horror as he stared at the gruesome spectacle of butchered remains lying lifeless before him. Nearby, a group of armed figures stood casually amidst the slaughter, laughing callously about stepping into the bloody entrails. He gasped in disbelief upon recognizing the tall, arrogant face of his former classmate, Matsunaga Rukizuna, who looked back at him with cold indifference. Turning toward him with a smirk, the armored student mockingly acknowledged the young man's presence, addressing him with the same vile insult from their school days. He demanded to know how his tormentor could possibly be in this world, only to receive a dismissive response that he had no idea either. His mind raced with shock as the classmate casually explained that 34 members of their entire class had been transported together, leaving only him behind. Suddenly, another familiar classmate named Yuguro Nori stepped forward, grinning malevolently as he held up a freshly severed head and taunted him about living with beasts. He crouched low, glaring up with burning resentment as the cruel insults continued to wash over him. He gasped in shock as a monstrous, blood-dripping creature suddenly loomed over the clearing, while his former classmates shouted out in excitement. Two massive, hulking orcs crashed down right before the group, bearing their ferocious fangs. Unfazed by the terrifying monsters, Diazuna gripped his glowing sword and spat curses at the beasts, readying his strike with absolute arrogance. With a single, devastating swing of his weapon, he unleashed a powerful named skill that cleaved both giant creatures in half before they could even react. As the severed bodies of the beasts collapsed heavily into the dirt, the group strolled past the gore without a care, casually chatting about how exciting it was to slaughter such monsters. Takashi could only watch in stunned silence as another classmate, Nobuo Kamada, casually held up a dripping trophy from the kill, jesting that the creature's sheer stupidity made them effortless prey. Turning their malice back toward their former classmate, the bullies began to mock Takashi's weakness, taunting him that his personal stats must be utterly worthless or deep in the negative numbers. With a cruel grin, Diazuna decided to check for himself, activating his search skill to force open Takashi's personal status interface. A glowing window materialized before Takashi's eyes, displaying a harsh reality. He was merely level 0, and his mysterious skill remained completely unidentified. Seeing the pitiful results, the group erupted into harsh laughter, endlessly mocking him for remaining at the starting level and questioning what anyone could possibly achieve with an unknown, useless power. He listened in stunned silence as Diazuna mockingly explained how a goddess-like entity had instructed them on using status jewels, leaving him thoroughly bewildered by concepts he didn't understand. The gang burst into cruel laughter, jeering that even the divine being must have snubbed him due to his ugly appearance, while reminding each other that the rest of their classmates had received proper guidance. As the mockery echoed around him, his gaze suddenly locked onto the bone-like pendants dangling from Diazuna's neck, a sickeningly familiar ornament belonging to Corellia. Horror seizing his heart, he blurted out a frantic question, demanding to know where they had gotten Corellia's necklace, which only prompted Diazuna to casually inquire if he happened to know any elves they had been hunting. The word hunting hit him like a physical blow, sending a wave of panic through his mind as Diazuna merely sighed in amusement at his utter confusion. With a predatory grin, the arrogant bully adjusted his posture and clarified his words with chilling satisfaction, revealing that they had been hunting women. Paralyzed by mounting dread, he listened helplessly as Diazuna gloated with sinister relish, describing how helpless the elf women were and boasting openly about taking the ornament from. Pure agony tore through his throat in a desperate scream as the image of Corellia's tearful, innocent face flashed before his eyes. Completely callous to his torment, the aggressors carried on with their repulsive conversation, laughingly recounting how she had finally stopped resisting after being violated repeatedly. Holding up the stolen trophy, he casually explained to his laughing accomplices that the girl had grown fierce when he tried to strip the necklace from her. Beside them, the helpless boy stood frozen, tears overflowing as the horrifying truth set in. With a cruel, satisfied grin, the ringleader raised the tooth pendant to his mouth and uttered the ultimate cruelty, callously declaring that he had killed her. The words struck like a physical blow, leaving the boy's eyes wide with sheer horror and uncomprehending grief. Tears streamed down his face as his knuckles whitened into a trembling fist, drawing sneers from the gang, who mockingly questioned if a mere pig like him had actually dared to love the elven girl. Driven beyond the brink by unbearable sorrow and rage, he let out a guttural scream and blindly charged forward, while the four bullies calmly waited for his frantic assault. Before he could close the distance, one of them activated a speed enhancement skill, instantly vanishing and reappearing behind him to deliver a brutal kick that sent him crashing face-first into the dirt. As the helpless boy lay writhing on the ground, the cruel ringleader stepped forward with a sadistic smile, announcing that it was time to mete out his punishment. High atop the isolated cliffside, the violent sounds of an uncompromising beating echoed into the open air. When the onslaught finally ceased, the bruised and bloody youth was left kneeling alone on the precipice, gasping heavily for breath while his tormentors casually turned their backs on him. He lay battered and helpless on the dirt as Diazuna loomed over him. Mockingly commanding the boy he called a pig to leap off the cliff. His tormentors found great amusement in the cruel display. Nori openly lamented not having a smartphone to record the death fall, while Kamada giddily urged him on. Panting heavily from his injuries, the shattered youth struggled for air, completely unable to comprehend why they were inflicting such mindless cruelty upon him as the group began to walk away. Kneeling in excruciating physical and emotional agony, he choked through his tears to voice his despair, questioning how anyone could murder or hurt another human so casually. Diazuna paused in his tracks, looking back cold and detached at the weeping boy whom he viewed as something less than human. As the helpless youth winced in pain, the arrogant bully spat out that they needed no reason for their violence, declaring that they were chosen individuals superior to common trash. With a wide, sickening smile, he compared the suffering boy to a cockroach or a nuisance insect, claiming anyone would naturally feel the desire to kill it without a second thought. Kamada joined in on the sadistic revelry, gleaming with dark pleasure as they reminded each other that in this unpoliced fantasy realm, they had total freedom to do whatever they pleased. Walking away into the distance, the gang left him collapsed alone at the cliff's edge, tossing back final, heartless jeers commanding him to jump. Blood dripping down his swollen face and tears burning in his eyes. A fierce, dark wrath took hold of his soul as he clenched his teeth, swearing an absolute vow never to forgive them. He lay helpless as Diazuna stared down at him with cold contempt, declaring how utterly exhausted he was by his presence. With a swift, cruel kick, the bully sent him hurtling over the edge of the sheer cliff. As he plummeted through the air toward the dense canopy below, his attackers complained from the precipice above, disappointed that the forest obscured his final impact and dismissing him as pathetic to the very end. He slammed into the cold waters of a murky forest swamp, the force of the fall knocking the breath from his lungs as he sputtered in pain. Lying half submerged in the mud, he gasped for air, bewildered by the realization that he was somehow still alive. Examining his muddy hands, he realized that the dense foliage and soft marshland had cushioned his descent. Driven by desperate concern for the village, he forced his battered body to stand and hurry back. Upon reaching the ridge overlooking his destination, he was greeted by rising plumes of thick, dark smoke billowing into the sky. The entire settlement lay in complete ruin, reduced to smoldering debris under a suffocating haze of ash and destruction. Staring in horror at the butchered remains and charred dwellings, he was overwhelmed by the crushing realization that everything had been destroyed. Collapsing to his knees among the wreckage, he wept uncontrollably, surrounded by the silent, lifeless forms of those he had failed to save. He remembered the joyous days in the village, recalling how the friendly pig folk would cheerfully call his name as they played together. But the painful shock of reality dragged his bloodshot eyes back to the present, filled with overwhelming horror. Memories of their shared warmth flashed through his mind, gathering around campfires, sharing meals, and splashing in the river with the villagers who had accepted him as one of their own. Above all, he remembered Corelia's gentle voice calling out to him with a brilliant, tender smile that brightened his darkest days. Overcome by the unbearable weight of his loss, he clutched his chest and let out a raw, agonizing scream that echoed through the desolate ruins. Tears mixed with blood as his fist pressed against the muddy earth, desperately whispering apologies to all those he could not protect. A bitter question burned within his soul. Why had he been left utterly powerless while those arrogant tormentors were granted extraordinary skills? Slamming his fist into the dirt in frustration, he roared in fury, consumed by a desperate longing for the power to avenge his fallen friends. He knew that if he had possessed even a fraction of strength, he might have been able to save Corelia from her tragic fate. With blood and tears running down his face, he threw his head back and bellowed like a wild beast, swearing a deep oath of vengeance against those responsible. He watched in awe as a massive, pig-like monster shattered a boulder with its bare fists, its raw physical power exploding in every direction. Under the pouring rain, he sat across from the hulking beast in quiet solitude, both burdened by the weight of their powerlessness and grief. Tears streaming down his face, he broke the silence by crying out in bitter anger, giving voice to the agonizing frustration that burned within both of them. Driven by a sudden wave of fierce resolve, he plunged his wooden spear into the ground, his eyes wide with unhinged fury. Standing before the entire gathering of orcs, he shouted at the top of his lungs, realizing that their rage matched his own boiling hatred. He challenged the beastly horde, asking if they were truly willing to remain silent after all the atrocities committed against them, rallying them against those who looked down upon them as lesser beings. Drawing a symbol in the dirt surrounded by the inspired crowd, his face twisted into an insane, menacing grin as he let out a roar for vengeance. In response, the orcs raised their weapons and fists toward the night sky, their united battle cry echoing beneath the pale light. Peering through the dense foliage, a pair of sharp, vengeful eyes locks onto the encampment as he softly mutters that he has finally tracked them down. Standing quietly among the trees, he is flanked by a squad of towering, muscle-bound orc warriors, coldly identifying the group below as their targets. Down in the clearing, Matsunaga Rukizuna casually adjusts his trousers, arrogance dripping from his tone as he gloats over the terrified girls chained to the ground. Right beside him, Yuguro Nori smirks in cruel agreement, insensitively commenting on their captives with cold detachment. Joining in their crude banter, Nobuo Kamada enthusiastically prepares his belt, eager for his turn before they traffic the prisoners away, prompting a lazy warning not to break them. Unbeknownst to the arrogant group, their weapons, armor, and protective magic items lie completely discarded in a haphazard pile near the campfire. Taking note of this fatal oversight from the shadows, the young commander touches his forehead, calculating that nearly every single enemy has stripped away their gear. Encircling the perimeter high above the clearing, his massive army of formidable orcs stands poised in the darkness, ready to spring an inescapable ambush. He casually oversaw the ambush, instructing his beastly forces to select their targets as the unsuspecting camp remained blissfully unaware. Raising his fist, he gave the signal for the primary strike, commanding his monstrous subordinates to hurl countless clay jars filled with oil straight into the target area. The earthenware containers shattered violently upon impact, drenching the ground and the helpless students in slick, highly flammable fluid. Flames instantly erupted across the perimeter, sending the panicked teens rolling across the dirt in desperate, screaming attempts to extinguish the intense heat. Confusion rapidly spiraled into sheer terror as the heavy smoke choked the air, leaving the bullies bewildered by the sudden inferno. Before they could make sense of the blaze, a punishing volley of heavy stones hurtled down from the treeline, slamming directly into their exposed backs. The brutal stone bombardment continued relentlessly, pelting the grounded victims without pause and battering them deeper into the soil. Cold, mocking laughter echoed down from above, taunting the helpless group as they squirmed in pain amidst the clearing. Recognizing the familiar voice speaking down to them, the battered ringleaders looked up in disbelief, horrified by the realization that their supposed victim was still alive. As the unrelenting barrage crushed their remaining resolve, they surveyed the perimeter only to realize that an entire legion of monsters had completely encircled them. He bellowed into the forest, furiously calling his target a coward and demanding he stop hiding as he sprinted down the dirt path in pursuit. Determined not to let his prey slip away, he activated his magic walk skill, bursting forward with magical velocity. Closing the gap instantly, he sneered, boasting that no one could outrun his superior movement skill as he reached out to seize his target. However, his triumph turned to horror in an instant as a volley of spears thrust from the shadows, impaling him while a horde of massive orcs materialized all around. As blood gushed from his wounds, his target turned around with cold composure, asking if he truly believed this was an attempt to flee. With a subtle gesture, he declared that the tables had turned, while the monstrous soldiers hoisted their helpless captive into the air upon their spears. Reaching out in desperation, he shrieked in agony, his face twisted in utter disbelief and terror. In stark contrast, his captor watched with unyielding, frigid eyes, completely indifferent to his torment. Cruelly cast back onto the dirt, he collapsed in a groaning heap, surrounded on all sides by the imposing squad of monstrous warriors. Looking up at the wall of pig-headed brutes, he dissolved into helpless tears, fruitlessly begging for his life. He screamed in agony as the monstrous beasts swarmed him, their brutal blows and piercing weapons tearing into his body in a horrific display of violence. Witnessing the horrific execution, the headband-wearing student staggered back in sheer disbelief, stuttering out accusations as he realized his classmate had casually murdered their former leader and summoned monsters to do it. With dark, cold eyes devoid of remorse, the young commander fixed a chilling gaze upon him, asking what possible reason he had to assume his life would be spared. Panicking, the boy tried to assert dominance by hurling insults, even as the cold-eyed youth stepped forward while casually balancing a glowing magic core in his palm. A quiet warning escaped his mouth, pointing out the dark shadows that had suddenly materialized directly behind the foolish student. Before he could even react, massive, dirt-caked hands clamped down on both sides of his skull with bone-crushing strength. As the helpless boy whimpered out a desperate plea for rescue, the dark-haired youth issued a cold, uncompromising command for his immediate execution. The heavy hands compressed inward until bones shattered and flesh yielded, ending the boy's life instantly in a brutal burst of gore before his lifeless body crumpled beside the rest. Sprawling in a pool of his own blood, the wounded ringleader spat weak curses, accusing his conqueror of relying on underhanded surprise attacks and beastly henchmen. Looking down at his ruined tormentor without a shred of pity, the young dark-haired fighter listened impassively as the dying bully questioned whether he was even human anymore. He looked down at his defeated tormentor, dismissively rejecting the plea for humanity by reminding him that he had never once treated others as human beings. To drive his hatred home, he delivered a brutal kick directly into his tormentor's face, sending the battered youth sprawling against the dirt. As he struck, a flood of bitter memories erupted within him, recalling every kick, hit, and humiliation he had suffered at the hands of his relentless classmates. He raged on, enumerating the atrocities they had committed, how they took everything, assaulted others, and murdered indiscriminately, callously dismissing their cruelty as mere sport. With relentless fury, his boot crushed down on the helpless bully's face, grinding him further into the dirt. Veins bulging and eyes wide with burning wrath, he screamed out that not a single one among them was innocent of these horrific crimes. Beneath his foot, the broken bully lay bleeding in silence, while the surrounding horde of summoned monsters watched the brutal judgment with grim fascination. Desperate for salvation, the fallen attacker whimpered a feeble plea for mercy, asking if he could ever be treated with even a shred of warmth. The youth stared down in disbelief as his former tormentor attempted to fabricate a pathetic excuse, claiming he had once tried to stop their classmates from burning his house down. The excuse quickly unraveled into absurd hypocrisy as the dying bully admitted his only contribution was remarking how sweet the burning house would smell, leaving the youth to watch in silent disdain as his monstrous minions jeered in the background. He glared down at his former tormentor, his eyes burning with fury as memories of flames flickered in his mind, while the coward protested that his cruel words were only meant as harmless jokes. Refusing to accept such a pathetic excuse, he loomed larger over his captive, whose panicked screams echoed as he backed away in terror. Driven by the agony of losing his family, he demanded to know who was truly responsible for the fatal fire, prompting the trembling bully to desperately disclaim any direct blame. Cowering in the dirt, the defeated classmate stammered that while he did not know every detail, he knew enough to know it was not his hands alone that struck the spark. His eyes widened in sheer disbelief as the horrific reality was dropped upon him. The entire class was complicit in the burning of his home. The kneeling boy pleaded that he couldn't stop the rest of the students from committing arson, insisting that he had even called the fire department in a desperate bid to clear his conscience. Attempting to paint himself as a victim of circumstance, his former bully offered a sickening, nervous smile while swearing he never wished for anyone to die. He stood frozen as the harrowing truth sank in, realizing that the tragedy that destroyed his life was a calculated, collective act of murder by those he saw every day. Images of his smiling classmates flooded his mind. Every face, including Fumina, now revealed to be monsters hiding behind everyday cheerful facades. As Matsunaga slyly gestured from the dirt, hoping his excuses had worked, the young commander stood quietly among his towering monstrous allies, his heart solidifying into pure, unadulterated vengeance. His wooden stake pierced straight through his tormentor's hand, driving deep into the earth and wrenching an agonized shriek from the fallen bully. Standing over the writhing figure, he harshly shut down the lies, demanding to know how a single person could have orchestrated his total ruin alone. Driven to utter desperation by the gruesome strike, the once arrogant bully dropped to his knees, frantically pleading for his life. He promised absolute submission, offering to act as an obedient dog for the rest of his days, and even lick the mud off his footwear if it meant surviving. To prove his desperate sincerity, he pressed his face flat against the cold earth and began frantically lapping at the dirt. Crying tears of pure terror, he begged for any command that would grant him a reprieve from death. Looking down at the pathetically groveling figure, he listened as the bully offered to fulfill any command, no matter how humiliating. With icy indifference, he quietly posed a single question before giving his ultimate response. If he wished for an order, then he should simply die. Elaborating on the sentence, he commanded his former tormentor to perish just like the innocent lives he had destroyed. He demanded that as he passed, he offer his final, desperate apology to the fallen elves, the slaughtered orcs, and to his beloved sister. A chilling realization paralyzed the groveling bully as he glanced past his captor toward the hulking orc warriors standing in quiet attendance. He recognized with mounting horror that the beastly forces were entirely subservient to the boy he had once so mercilessly abused. As the helpless bully tried to stutter out a desperate denial, he loomed over him with a shadow-shrouded face and an unblinking, terrifying glare. He coldly reasoned that just as anyone would naturally squash a cockroach or a fly buzzing before them, he felt the exact same drive to eliminate him. Before the panicked shrieks for mercy could fully escape the bully's throat, he plunged the wooden spear directly into the back of his neck. The fatal strike pierced through with brutal precision, silencing his enemy permanently in a splatter of blood. Standing completely still above the lifeless body while his monstrous allies looked on, he gazed down at his trembling hands and the bloodied weapon. For the first time, the gravity of what he had done washed over him, realizing he had crossed an irrevocable threshold by taking a human life. A bitter, hollow laugh escaped his lips as the psychological shock fractured his composure. In that moment of morbid clarity, memories flashed before his mind. Visions of his former classmates casually smiling, laughing, and filming his torment, reminding him that his bloody retribution had only just begun. He scoffed at the platitude often repeated in stories, that revenge solves nothing. Standing among his loyal monstrous followers, he knew better than to accept such empty idealism. Clenching his spear with trembling rage, he rejected the notion entirely. If the perpetrators went unpunished, they would simply continue living in peaceful contentment while their victims suffered in silence, an injustice he refused to tolerate. Images of his former life flooded his mind, remembering the quiet torment he endured inside the classroom while those around him watched in cold indifference. The memories shifted to a settlement consumed by raging flames, its structures crumbling under intense heat as destruction swept through the land. Through the thick smoke and burning debris, a faint, desperate cry echoed, buried beneath the roar of the fire. The inferno raged unchecked, searing every corner of the village into ash and cinder. A chilling grin broke across his shadowed face, his eyes wide with a twisted sense of gratitude for the crucible that transformed him. Turning back to the ranks of beastmen assembled behind him, he stood poised at the head of a formidable army ready to carry out his will. A vision of his entire high school class appeared before his mind's eye, fueling his ultimate decree to grind their bones to dust in this new world. With venom dripping from his gaze, he listened as his monstrous lieutenants burst into booming laughter over the freshly spilled blood of their enemies. He raised his staff high into the night sky, framed against twin full moons, declaring to his roaring horde that their bloody revenge was finally underway. With 31 targets left to hunt down and concealed behind a wooden pillar, he watched the bustling town as bitter memories surfaced in his mind. It had been his former classmate's fault that his sister was burned to death, and now, after being summoned into this realm, those very same monsters stood directly before his eyes. Before him, those despicable classmates were actively roasting a helpless townsperson over an open flame, smiling sadistic smiles while their victims screamed out in horrific agony. As the victim's grieving family wept in absolute terror, one of the tormentors, Natsuki Iwamoto, bellowed threats at the horror-struck crowd, warning that this brutal fate awaited anyone who dared oppose them. Driven by vengeful intent, the young wanderer recalled how he had used a local map to track these 3 ruthless thugs to this very settlement. He watched as the tyrants posed proudly near the charred stake where the burnt corpse still hung, completely indifferent to the weeping family prostrated on the ground before them. Taking a sick delight in the cruelty, one of the aggressors licked his lips greedily while staring at the smoldering, charred remains. He then addressed the terrified villagers directly, mockingly ordering them to bow down and swear allegiance if they wanted to avoid a similar death. Joining his fellow tormentor, The two struck ridiculous hand poses and loudly proclaimed themselves to be part of the ruling group known as the 34 Heroes. Watching from behind his wooden barrier, Kainu glared at them with cold, burning vengeance, knowing full well what kind of vile monsters these so-called heroes truly were. He remembered how individuals with extraordinary abilities had suddenly appeared in this world, wielding powers far beyond human comprehension. In a single instant, those former classmates of his had vanquished the world's demon lord, leaving mountains of slaughtered monsters in their wake. Hailed as legendary heroes across the realm, they were welcomed into the capital with grand parades and endless praise from the cheering crowds. Yet it was not long before that overwhelming power turned into unchecked malice, directed squarely at the helpless populace. Driven by sadistic arrogance, they used their overwhelming magic to inflict extreme violence, sneeringly debating who among the terrified locals should be their next target. Even the female students shared this callous contempt, with Mayuko Tsudama looking down upon the native citizens as mere filthy barbarians from inside her lavish horse-drawn carriage. Beside her, Yumiko Haramatsu and Keiko Furui idly stretched and joked about their cruelty, rationalizing their tyranny as mercy while reveling in the thrill of being evil. Bound by heavy iron chains behind the carriage, bloodied and gagged male villagers were forced to march like subjugated livestock, weeping in agonizing pain and humiliation. As the procession moved through the town square, a young village girl sobbed inconsolably before the smoldering stake where her father had just been burned alive, surrounded by the predatory grins of her tormentors. Leaning in close over the traumatized maiden, the arrogance-filled youth made crude remarks about her body, mocking her grief while sinisterly offering to take care of her now that her protector was dead. He and his ruthless companions cornered the helpless family, ignoring the mother's desperate screams for her daughter, Karna, to run for her life. When the desperate mother tried to intervene, he brutally kicked her aside before drawing forth a swirling, magical stream of water from his pendant. As the magical current whirled through the air, it bound the terrified girl in constriction tendrils, leaving her completely helpless while he laughed in sadistic delight. Viewing her helpless state, the tyrant licked his lips with a predatory sneer, savoring her terror like a predator evaluating its prey. Watching the cruelty unfold, his burly companion burst into laughter, mockingly admiring the girl's short haircut as they took pleasure in her humiliation. Leaning in uncomfortably close, he remarked on how much the weeping girl resembled a popular idol from their original world, extending his tongue near her face as she recoiled in disgust. While the two tormentors focused on the girl, their pyromancer ally unleashed his fire magic upon the stake, warning the pleading mother that she would share her husband's burning fate if she interfered. As flames consumed the man, the villains touched their fingertips together in a twisted gesture, reminiscing with dark amusement about previous times they had burned people alive. Continuing their vulgar jokes, they called the girl a pig's sister, completely unaware that Kainu was watching them from nearby, his eyes burning with monstrous, vengeful fury. This cruelty was intimately familiar to Kainu, triggering painful memories of high school, where these same bullies had relentlessly humiliated him over his sister's newspaper scandal. His memory pulled him back to the devastating news article that had shattered his world, a report detailing the fatal house fire that took his sister. As he stared blankly at the paper, his high school tormentors had swarmed around him, waving the news clipping and callously demanding photos of his sister while mocking her short haircut. Their cruel laughter had echoed through the classroom as they relentlessly jeered, asking if she had to be cremated twice and calling him a heartless demon for his stunned silence. Because of that overwhelming grief and the helplessness he felt when they ordered him to laugh at her death, a dark resolve finally ignited within him, prompting him to call upon spirits to exact his vengeance. In response to his desperate plea for power, two imposing, beastly figures materialized before him, ready to receive his commands. With their glowing eyes fixed ahead, the summonings braced themselves to carry out the terrible retribution he desired. Their grotesque amusement was suddenly interrupted when several strange, bubbling slime entities manifested on the floor right before their eyes. Rather than sensing danger, the lead bully merely sneered at the foul creatures, arrogantly joking that the reeking slimes would serve as fitting air fresheners for their mansion. He and his allies gasped as they recognized the figure standing atop the grand stairwell, realizing that the young man they had tormented back home had somehow been brought to this world as well. Bursting into cruel, mockery-filled laughter, the bully sneered and asked how a wretched pig like him could possibly exist in this realm alongside them. Unmoved by the insults hurled from below, the dark-haired youth glared down from the landing, his voice dropping into a deadly whisper as he confronted his former abusers. With venom bursting from his chest, he roared his accusation across the hall, declaring that it was they who had set his family home ablaze. The gang dismissed the outburst with baffled scoffing, but he pressed onward, reminding them of a specific comment made in the past regarding his sister's short hair. While his adversary mockingly reasoned that anyone could have seen her around town, the grieving brother countered that his sister, Fumina, had been bedridden for years and spent those months growing her hair long in isolation. Memories of that quiet bedroom surfaced, recalling the gentle afternoon when the frail girl had smiled and asked her brother to cut her heavy locks short for the summer. Because their poor household could never afford a proper stylist, he had taken up the shears himself, meticulously trimming her hair while they shared quiet moments together. It was on the very day of the tragic fire that he had finally cut her hair, a detail kept strictly within the walls of their secluded room. Returning to the present with furious conviction, he trapped his tormentors in their own lie, exposing that no one could have known about her short hair unless they were inside the house right before setting it on fire. His damning logic leaves the two culprits speechless for a brief, heavy moment as they process the revelation. Suddenly, the pair erupt into hysterical, mocking laughter, their boisterous cackles echoing across the mansion floor while he remains motionless on the stairs above. Leaning in with grotesque, arrogant grins, they look up at him without a trace of shame, challenge ringing in their voices as they ask what he intends to do about it. They openly acknowledge their past atrocity, callously pointing out that they are in a new world now and mocking him as a weakling who cannot avenge his dead sister. Rather than breaking under their cruelty, an unsettling, wide smile spreads across his face as he admits feeling a profound sense of relief that they are even more irredeemable than he thought. With all moral hesitation wiped away, he coolly informs them that their utter lack of remorse means he can kill them without an ounce of pity, striking a sudden chord of unease in his aggressors. Infuriated by his audacity, Furuso lashes out verbally, refusing to let a piece of garbage act superior to them. The brute mockingly highlights his dismal status screen, pointing out his level 0 rating and unreadable skills as proof of his weakness. Consumed by rage, Furuso orders his comrade to drag the former classmate outside so he can burn him alive, sneering that even in another world, pigs remain at the bottom. Nearby, Kawai turns his sadistic gaze onto the trembling girl, threatening to burn both her and her mother to ash if she dares to take a single step. He sneered maliciously alongside his imposing companion, taunting their captive opponent with grotesque delight as they prepared to inflict further torment. Surged with cruel ambition, the attacker unleashed long, fluid tendrils across the grand staircase, shouting his intent to break his target's spirit completely. Because of this incoming assault, the youth gave a sharp signal, triggering the release of a massive chandelier from the ceiling cables directly above the stairwell. The heavy fixture plummeted, severing the traps and dropping a hidden mass of foul, writhing creatures straight onto the unsuspecting assailants. Engulfed in a torrential swarm of noxious slimes, the two men shrieked in sudden agony and revulsion as the acidic organisms covered their bodies. Observing the chaotic scene from a distance, the quiet youth noted with grim satisfaction that even these self-proclaimed heroes were helpless against the overpowering stench and slime. Unable to endure the suffocating stench, the disgraced fighters scrambled blindly across the floor toward the courtyard fountain in a desperate bid for clean water. They collapsed awkwardly over the stone basin, diving face-first into the pool to wash away the vile substance. Splattering and coughing violently in the fountain, the pair spit out the disgusting residue while their opponents stood composed nearby, watching their humiliation. Realizing they had been completely outmaneuvered by a hidden skill, the brute barked orders in rage and panic, demanding his allies apprehend the cunning youth immediately. He watched in disbelief as the paralysis took hold, unaware that the fountain water had been laced with paralyzing physalis juice specifically prepared to immobilize them. Mocking the attempt, he wiped his face and scoffed that such a trick could never work on a hero, only for his rival to point calmly behind him and ask what was lurking in his shadow. Before he could turn around, a massive, muscular orc rose up directly behind him, swinging a heavy wooden club down with crushing force. Thoroughly battered and helpless, both bullies soon found themselves bound in chains against a cold stone wall, trembling as the paralyzing toxin froze their bodies. Flanked by his towering, monstrous allies, the vengeful youth stepped forward, announcing that the time had come to interrogate them about his sister's death. With a chilling, shadowed expression in his eyes, he promised that only after they had suffered far more than she ever did would he grant them the mercy of. As consciousness slowly returned, the glasses-wearing student was startled to discover himself bound tightly to a chair by heavy ropes. Turning his head with difficulty, he realized his companion, Iwamoto, was sitting beside him in the exact same helpless state. Looking across the dimly lit room, they discovered their captors standing at the far end of a long dining table. It was Tamaru, enveloped in a heavy hooded cloak, staring back at them with a cold, unwavering intensity. Enraged by the sight of his former victim holding all the power, the tied-up student burst into an angry tirade, shouting Tamaru's name in utter disbelief. Unfazed by the hostility, he stepped forward into the light of the table's candles, causing his captive to gasp as a sinister tension filled the silent room. He held up several dark, polished spheres in his palm, causing the captive to sweat in horror as he recognized the key objects they had relied on to manipulate the heroes. Sitting down calmly at the head of the long table, he began lightly tapping his fingers on the surface, indifferent to the larger prisoner's nervous demand to know their fate. He simply declared that they were going to play a fun dictation game. As his fingers rested on the table, memories of his high school entry surged back into his mind, recalling the bitter day his torment began. Back then, these same two classmates had approached him with a self-improvement book, smugly instructing him to perform a self-analysis by listing 7 of his personal flaws. He recalled the day 2 seemingly sympathetic classmates approached him after witnessing his torment, inquiring softly if he was suffering from relentless bullying. Apologizing for their past inaction, the student with glasses expressed solemn regret that they had stood by helplessly while he was targeted. His companion chimed in with enthusiasm, claiming that they too had once been victims of severe harassment until a self-improvement guide gave them the strength to transform their lives. Offering a gentle suggestion, they urged him to attempt a self-analysis exercise from the book, reassuring him that there was no pressure if he felt hesitant. Weighing their deceptive kindness, a fragile glimmer of hope flickered within him as he contemplated taking their advice to escape his suffering. Deciding to trust their intentions, he agreed to write down his personal flaws, completely unaware of the malicious trap being set for him. The following morning, his stomach churned as he discovered the handwritten list of his deepest insecurities missing from his desk. Forced to stand paralyzed at the front of the classroom, he watched helplessly as a wave of malicious laughter erupted among his peers. At the front of the room, his orchestrator proudly displayed a book detailing psychological deception, mockingly explaining to the class how simple it was to dupe someone who was overly trusting. Unveiling the full extent of their cruelty, the tormentors took turns reading his intimate confessions aloud line by line, subjecting his flaws to brutal public ridicule. His deeply personal written confession was paraded in front of the entire classroom, while his tormentors mocked him relentlessly. The bullies roared with laughter, calling his earnest self-reflection a masterpiece of pathetic flaws. The painful memory rushed through his mind, how every attempt to seek help or fit in only resulted in further humiliation, physical violence, and absolute despair. Though tears of past anguish streamed down his face, his expression hardened into one of cold, unforgiving hatred. Nothing had changed about the cruelty of the world, but now he held all the power. Returning to the present, he addressed his former captors seated across the long table, instructing them that it was now their turn to write out their confessions on the cloth before them. A thick curtain dropped between the two prisoners, isolating them completely so neither could see what the other was recording. He issued a chilling ultimatum. They were to write without seeing each other, and if any discrepancies were found between their accounts, he would execute them immediately. Before they could even question how they were supposed to write without ink, massive hands reached down from behind and firmly grabbed them by their earlobes. With brutal force, the ears were sliced, sending blood spurting as the captives shrieked in agony from the sudden, excruciating pain. Staring back at them with cold, unrelenting eyes, he informed them that blood would be their ink, ordering them to dip their fingers into their wounds and begin writing. He stared coolly across the partition at his bound tormentors, reminding them of the relentless torment they had inflicted upon him for years, framing his current actions as nothing more than long overdue retribution. As the two prisoners whimpered and struggled against their bindings, he instructed them to write legibly with their blood so every word could be scrutinized. He then posed his first question, demanding a detailed breakdown of the abilities possessed by all the remaining members of their class as the terrified pair scribbled furiously. Once the exhaustive interrogation finally concluded, the two tormented captives sat quivering, bathed in cold sweat as they awaited his judgment. Taking hold of the blood-stained documents, he prepared to cross-examine their written testimonies side by side. Announcing that it was time to reveal the results of their independent confessions, his cold statement sent a sharp spike of panic through both men. He declared that a lie had been discovered between their accounts, decreeing that the punishment for such deceit would be death by fire as an ogre stoked a massive pyre behind them. Panic erupted as the two captives realized their testimonies regarding the arson incident contradicted each other, leading them to turn on one another in a desperate bid for self-preservation. Before they could settle their violent accusation, the giant ogres seized both men and hoisted them into the air, despite their shrill cries that they truly knew nothing of the crime. Looking down upon his former abusers, he quietly declared that from this moment onward, he would never allow himself to be degraded or treated like filth ever again. He announced to his captives that he was finished with them and would inflict no further punishment himself. Before the bound men could draw a sigh of relief, however, a sudden pause caught in his throat. Turning toward the young woman standing silently in the chamber, he gestured in her direction and posed a fatal question to the room. She remained completely motionless, her gaze fixed forward with cold, unyielding resolve. He reminded her of the cruel fate her father had suffered at the hands of these very men, watching as terror instantly seized the helpless captives. Leaving their fate entirely in her hands, he asked her to deliver her own judgment upon them. As she stepped forward, the helpless men shrieked in desperation, begging endlessly for mercy and forgiveness under her unblinking glare. Ignoring their pleas, a sudden burst of flames erupted around the bound prisoners, engulfing the wooden pyre beneath them in a fiery blast. The captives writhed on the stone floor in agony, screaming frantically for someone to extinguish the roaring fire consuming them. She watched impassively as the flames took hold, deaf to their desperate cries, while one prisoner warned the other that struggling only made the fire burn hotter. She watched coldly as the bound captives panicked, their shrieks filling the hall as they desperately pointed blame toward the young man, claiming he alone was responsible for the flames. Terrified of burning alive, the headband-wearing bully shrieked in desperation, insisting they were merely forced to follow orders and would perish if not freed immediately. Continuing their desperate pleas, they swore to divulge every detail of the torment they had inflicted, begging to be brought down from the burning platform. The young man observed their sniveling display without a flicker of pity, listening to their frantic cries for release. From the pyre, the captives offered complete submission, promising total obedience and full confessions if only their lives were spared. Turning to leave the fate of their tormentors in her hands, the young man stepped back as she silently gathered a container filled with liquid. Assuming she brought water to quench the fire, the tied men frantically screamed for her to douse the flames quickly. Instead of quenching the blaze, the liquid hurled upon them caused the flames to violently erupt and engulf their bodies. Agonizing shrieks split the air as the burning captives realized in horror that she had poured accelerant onto the fire. She stood completely impassive, watching unblinkingly as the flames consumed them amidst their hopeless screams for mercy. While she watched the ash settle from her vengeance, elsewhere, a cloaked man stood trembling with rage inside a quiet chamber, clutching a wooden table. His knuckles turned white as he dug his hands into the lace cloth, tearing at the fabric in sheer agony. Unable to contain his fury, he slammed his fist down onto the table, screaming Tokinori Yasuda's name with burning hatred. In his memory, Tokinori Yasuda had been the embodiment of perfection, a handsome heir to a prominent political family, blessed with exceptional grades and athletic talent. He had been universally beloved, always offering a bright smile and a warm greeting to classmates like Hirota whenever they crossed paths. For an ordinary student like Hirota, receiving such friendly attention from someone so popular had felt almost surreal. He remembered that Yasuda was actually the very first classmate to speak to him in high school, leaving a lasting impression with his flawless demeanor. Yasuda had even treated him with unexpected respect, mentioning how grateful he was because Hirota's mother worked as a housekeeper at his family's grand estate. That comfortable life continued until one completely ordinary afternoon, as Hirota walked home casually, pondering what to cook for dinner. Suddenly, a body plummeted out of the sky, crashing down onto the concrete right in front of his disbelieving eyes. He stared down in horror as he recognized the broken figure sprawled across the concrete. It was Fumina, rushing to her side. He scooped up her limp, bleeding body, screaming her name over and over as he begged her to hold on. As he desperately sought help, his eyes locked onto Yasuda, who stood nearby watching the tragic scene with cold, unbothered detachment. He pleaded frantically with Yasuda to use his vehicle to rush her to a hospital, while his weak sister could barely utter a faint whisper. Instead of helping, the wealthy heir simply climbed into his car and drove away, ignoring the distraught cries calling after him. Left all alone in silence, he could only kneel beside his sister in overwhelming grief and utter helplessness. To make matters worse, someone entirely unrelated later turned themselves into the police, officially closing the investigation and leaving Yasuda completely unpunished while Fumina lay bedridden. Already frail before the incident, his sister's health deteriorated rapidly, fueling an insurmountable rage within his heart against the family that got away clean. Replaying the memory of Yasuda stepping casually into his luxury vehicle without a second backward glance, he recalled the desperate call he had made that day. His face twisted with intense hatred, permanently burning the desire for retribution into his soul. He confronted his wealthy classmate with raw emotion, demanding to know why no assistance had been offered to his injured sister on that fateful day. His voice cracked with desperation as he brought up the hit and run, shouting that prompt medical attention could have prevented his sister's severe condition. In response, his affluent peer offered a surprisingly calm concession, admitting with an impassive gaze that he did indeed feel remorse for what occurred. Surprised by the sudden admission, he pressed further, seeking confirmation that the boy was finally acknowledging his guilt. However, the callous youth merely stared up at the sky, casually clarifying that his sole regret was being delayed for a cherry blossom viewing gathering. Stunned by such a monstrous justification, he could only stammer in total disbelief, unable to process such shocking coldness. Elaborating with complete indifference, the elite student gestured loosely, explaining that high-profile figures in politics and finance were present at the event he was late for. He expressed sorrow not for the dying girl left in the street, but exclusively for worrying his senior associates by arriving late to their social gathering. As rain began to patter down around them, he stood rooted to the spot, gripped by profound horror at the sociopathic nature of the man before him. Sheltered beneath an attendant's umbrella, the cold-hearted heir stepped toward his vehicle, leaving the heartbroken brother echoing in useless protest. He recoiled in utter disbelief, shouting at his classmate for daring to compare a trivial social event to his sister's life, but the highborn youth merely glanced up, coldly denying any comparison. As the young man stared in horror, Yasuda explained with chilling calm that a peasant sister's life could never compare to the refined world he belonged to. Standing beneath his umbrella in the pouring rain, the heir declared that every single moment was far too precious to upper-class citizens like himself to be wasted. Choking on his words as tears mixed with the rain, he watched helplessly while Yasuda calmly made his way toward the waiting vehicle. Driven by sheer desperation, he screamed after his tormentor, demanding that he take back his cruel words immediately. Stopping near the luxury car, Yasuda turned back slightly, casually pointing out the delicate reality of his victim's single-parent household. Fixing him with a terrifying, vacant stare, the wealthy student delivered a dark ultimatum, asking if he could truly afford to jeopardize his mother's livelihood. The terrifying implication shattered his remaining defiance, forcing him to stand frozen while Yasuda smoothly boarded the car and ordered the driver to depart. With a low rumble, the black sedan glided away into the stormy afternoon, abandoning the distraught boy on the lonely sidewalk. Collapsing onto his knees in the downpour, he was left broken and utterly helpless, marking the day his daily torment at school escalated to unbearable heights. He knelt in the dark as an overwhelming wave of resentment began to boil beneath the surface. Standing amid the burning embers of his memory, the truth burned clearer than ever, that Yasuda was the sole mastermind behind all his suffering. His mind flashed back to their high school days, to a peaceful classroom scene where all the students had gathered to pose happily for a group photograph. Afterwards, a girl had inspected the digital camera with a bright smile, admiring how wonderfully the picture had come out. Another classmate had chimed in with enthusiasm, calling out to take one more shot and telling everyone to forced harmony. At the center of it all was Yasuda, resting his chin on his hand with a refined, spotless composure, hiding his dark cruelty behind a charming facade. The recollection of that deceptive, handsome face sent a volcanic rage ripping through him, twisting his features as he gnashed his teeth in unbridled fury. Driven to the absolute brink by vengeance, a single name roared from the depths of his soul: Yasuda. His mind consumed by unyielding hatred, he stands surrounded by roaring flames, issuing a lethal vow against his sworn enemy. In this new world, none of the former protections will shield his target, and nothing in existence possesses the power to stop his relentless campaign of slaughter until all 29 remaining Mayuko Tsudama of Class 3B stood in silence, her expression stern and unreadable as she observed the grim aftermath unfolding around them. Beside her, laborers dragged away two charred, blackened corpses from the dirt, grimacing in open disgust at the horrific remains. As the bodies were moved, her classmates Keiko Furuya and Yumiko Hiramatsu looked on, wondering aloud if those burnt husks were truly Iwamoto and Kamura, until a nearby search skill confirmed their identities. Staring at the shriveled, lifeless forms slumping against the stone wall, another classmate clicked his tongue in disdain, questioning how two heroes endowed with cheat skills could have died so easily. Unbothered by the brutal deaths, the girls casually dismissed the loss, remarking that with fewer sleazy people around, the world had simply become a more beautiful place. Hidden beneath the shadow of dense foliage, a young observer watched his former peers in silent revulsion. Nearby, two armored students openly grumbled about the burden of inspecting their fallen classmates' remains, treating human life as little more than a tedious chore. Unmoved by the deaths around them, the armored youths debated the unnatural apathy of their group. One of them questioned why no one seemed shaken by the demise of their own companions, baffled by the complete absence of grief. Disgusted by the tart flavor of his food, one of the male students casually tossed a half-eaten fruit out of the carriage, completely indifferent to where it landed. As the fruit struck the dirt, a desperate group of starving villagers threw themselves to the ground, screaming for food and scrambling over one another just to claim the discarded rind. Watching the pitiful struggle from their elevated vantage point, the students smirked and laughed at the villagers' degradation, taking cruel amusement in their extreme misery. As one starving local devoured the discarded scraps directly from the mud, the students continued their cruel banter, mocking his desperation and congratulating themselves on being above such poverty, while the hidden youth clenched his teeth in silent rage. Turning to her companion, one of the female students expressed her distaste, mocking the strange cousin Mayuko possessed. Nearby in the foliage, the hidden young man glared at them with unabated malice. Dismissing the insult with a shrug, she remarked that despite his repellent nature, he was still technically considered a hero. She instructed her peer that should anything happen to her, the event must be reported directly to Yasuda to avoid any narrative manipulation. In their minds, Yasuda remained the indisputable authority figure of Class 3B, an unwavering leader whose command extended even into this dangerous foreign realm. Weary of the tedious investigation, She stepped forward and raised her hand, her magical ring glowing softly as she prepared to turn her attention toward the helpless villagers scattered before them. She channeled her inner power through the glowing ring on her finger, triggering her skill to manipulate the liquid inside an unfortunate villager's body. The helpless victim contorted in excruciating agony as the water within him turned against him, leaving the onlookers gasping in terror. Having displayed her lethal control, she calmly reasoned to her companions that eliminating the local rebels themselves was the only way to ensure no rival squad claimed glory for suppressing the uprising, especially after losing their own classmates in the initial revolt. Her cold efficiency drew eager praise from her peers, who commended her top-ranking intellect and brutal pragmatic approach to suppressing the villagers. Flushed with self-importance, the group smugly declared that suppressing this rebellion was their rightful duty as the true heroes of this world. Turning their cruelty back onto the crowd, the students forced the starving peasants to crawl in the dirt, declaring that subhumans had no right to stand on two legs in their presence. Another student summoned a horde of blackbirds with her taming ability, sending the shrieking flock to mercilessly dive-bomb and peck at the defenseless villagers below. Amidst the flurry of feathers and screams, a lone trembling child struggled to remain standing while the students watched the torment with sadistic amusement. Stepping forward, she held out a piece of fruit toward the shivering boy, feigning generosity by offering it to him as a reward for surviving their punishment. Just as the starving boy reached out in desperate hope, she violently kicked the fruit away, causing him to collapse to the ground in agonized despair. Watching the helpless child curl into a ball and cry out for his mother, she offered only a cold, mocking grin, entirely unbothered by his suffering. She watched calmly as dark magic coalesced, crystallizing a living target into a tiny, glowing gem. Keiko Furuya displayed her skill, Jewel Collector, which turns any creature she touches into a jewel. Examining the small stone in her hand, she wondered aloud if the gem's size was proportional to the target's original body mass. While hidden in the nearby bushes, Yasuda gritted his teeth in suppressed fury as he witnessed their casual cruelty. Dismissing the villagers as subhuman scum, Keiko rationalized their behavior by recalling how they acted back in their original world, where extortion and blackmail were already second nature to them. In a memory from their high school days, Mayuko confronted Hirota with a photo on her smartphone, showing a moment on a crowded train where he was holding his younger sister, framing the innocent moment as an act of harassment. Another classmate joined in with vulgar laughter, mocking Hirota and asking if he derived pleasure from inappropriate acts with his own sister, leaving Hirota flustered as he tried to defend himself. He desperately insisted that he had only caught his sister when she stumbled on the train, but his peers refused to listen, twisting his explanation into further vulgar mockery. Realizing the futility of arguing, Hirota lowered his head and offered an apology, desperate to end the humiliation and protect his family. Mayuko smiled with mock gentleness, accepting his apology while offering a chilling assurance that she would pay his sister special attention. Hirota gasped in terror as she casually recited intimate personal details about his 14-year-old sister, exposing how thoroughly she had stalked his family. Mayuko's serene demeanor twisted into a sickening grin of pure malice as she demanded that Hirota introduce his young sister to the boys in their class so they could all play with her. She casually brought up the video, leaving the helpless boy frozen in sheer terror as the full reality of her blackmail sunk in. Driven to utter desperation by her cruel leverage, he dropped to his knees, frantically begging them to leave his innocent younger sister out of their malice. Unmoved by his desperate pleas, the group coldly informed him that if he truly wanted to beg for mercy, he would have to perform a proper bow of total surrender right then and there. They smirked maliciously as they dictated the exact humiliating speech he was required to recite, demanding that he refer to himself as a lowly, foolish pig pleading for orders. Though his body trembled with suppressed rage and hatred, the agonizing threat to his family forced him to bend his knees and lower his body toward the floor. The bullies watched with utter contempt, delighting in his complete degradation as he prepared to speak the scripted words of submission. Pressing his forehead against the ground in full submission, he choked out the required chant, yielding his pride entirely just to keep his sister safe. Satisfied with his total humiliation, They snapped photos of his degrading display, declaring that he had been officially demoted to their personal slave from that day onward. Following that day, his endless nightmare began, as they forced him to carry school backpacks filled to the brim with heavy stones across the courtyard. Weighted down by the crushing load tied around his body, he was forced into the water to create a spectacle while they readied their cameras to capture his agony. He sat helplessly near the edge of the pool while his tormentors casually posed for photos, treating his plight as nothing more than a background detail. Moments later, a heavy splash resonated as he plunged into the deep water under the crushing weight of the stones, yet the girls barely broke their joyful poses. Surfacing with desperate gasps for air, he fought to stay afloat, only to be greeted by their callous mockery as they laughed at his poor timing. As he choked and slipped beneath the surface once more, they voiced only annoyance that his struggling was ruining their perfect picture. Despite his muffled cries and agony, the continuous click of the camera shutter sealed his utter degradation into digital memory. Returning to the harsh reality of the present, the agonizing memory burned in the protagonist's mind, contorting his face into a mask of pure, unadulterated fury. Completely oblivious to the monstrous rage brewing nearby, Mayuko and her group casually discussed the medieval realm's lack of modern technology as they boarded their carriage. From the shadow of the dense tree line, he observed them in silence, listening as they callously dismissed the brutal deaths of their former classmates. Upon hearing that they had targeted his sister as well, his eyes widened with intense malice, swearing an absolute refusal to ever forgive their atrocities. Realizing that the rest of their class was scattered isolated across distant towns without hope of aid, he resolved to deliver the most ruthless retribution possible. His trap was set as the horse-drawn carriage rolled along the open road toward its destination. Upon reaching the Grand Manor house, the passengers inside celebrated their arrival, completely unaware of what awaited them. As they peered out from the carriage window, Mayuko and her companions recognized Hirota standing before them in a heavy cloak, prompting them to mockingly address him. He confronted them directly, asking if they had returned to make him their slave once more, while Mayuko sneered at his unsettling presence and questioned if he too had been summoned to this world. Intrigued by his sudden reappearance, she activated her appraisal ability to inspect his capabilities, only to find a mysterious blank status screen. The group burst into laughter after confirming he possessed no special skills, continuing their relentless verbal abuse while he quietly admitted his lack of power. Suddenly, Hirota revealed he was merely a decoy as a massive brute violently flipped the entire carriage, sending the passengers crashing to the ground in terror. Disoriented and bruised, the group scrambled out from the wreckage only to be horrified by the towering, menacing orcs looming directly over them. Desperate to defend herself, Mayuko raised her magical ring to cast her Guilty Maker spell, but a powerful orc instantly lunged forward to strike her down. Her fingers were crushed in the brutal assault as birds swooped from above under the command of an unseen tamer, sealing the ambush and leaving the surviving classmates helpless. She screamed in agony as the towering, muscular monsters closed in, mercilessly beating her and her companions into total submission. The brutal beatdown continued unabated, bone-crushing impacts echoing as the remaining classmate cowered on the ground in overwhelming pain and terror. With the violent outbursts subsiding, the cloaked mastermind quietly stepped forward beside the trembling young man, watching the last of the resistance collapse to the dirt. Glaring up at his captor, the defeated classmate spat bitter curses, labeling him a greedy jewel collector, yet his defiance crumbled as he slumped beside the broken form of his leader. Stripped of her magical authority, the enchanted ring fell uselessly into the dirt, marking the complete loss of her powers to the shadowy figure and his monstrous ally. Surrounded on all sides by towering beasts, the bound captives huddled together in despair, while the young boy looked on with wide, horror-struck eyes at their bleak reality. Later, amidst the bustling crowd of a crowded town square, cloaked figures blended seamlessly into the onlookers, anticipating the public reckoning that was about to unfold. Upon a massive wooden scaffold erected before the gathered masses, the three captives were displayed prominently, tied securely to steep wooden ramps above the crowd. Straining against her bindings, Mayuko demanded to know what was happening, only to be sternly warned by a hooded overseer that any attempt to escape would result in immediate death. Helplessly stretched across the wooden incline, she looked out over the sea of spectators in mounting terror, realizing the full scale of the public judgment awaiting them. She looked down in terror at the gathering mob of angry townspeople, all brandishing axes, hoes, and makeshift weapons. Beside her, her companion cried out in panic, demanding to know who these vengeful villagers were. The hooded figure above explained that the crowd consisted of families who had suffered from their cruelty, people branded as hideous and cast aside, who had readily assembled at his call for retribution. He then announced a sadistic game called the Shout Quiz, warning them that unless they answered his question correctly and first, the wooden board supporting them would tilt downward toward the mob. Looking over the town square, he posed his first question to the captives, asking them where Yasuda was located. Desperate to save themselves, the three captives shouted wildly at once. Each blurted out contradicting directions to the north and west. Rejecting all their frantic attempts, he dismissed their vague answers as completely incorrect and useless. With a heavy clanking of gears, the wooden ramps lurched violently downward, slipping the panicked prisoners even closer to the hostile mob. As sheer panic overtook the bound captives, their captor watched on with cold satisfaction, reveling in their mounting terror. Exposed and completely helpless atop the sloped ramp, she suffered the ultimate humiliation under the grim gazes of the vengeful mob gathered high above an agitated mob. Three bound captives were positioned along sliding wooden ramps under the watchful eye of a hooded figure. He delivered a harsh ultimatum, warning them that failure to speak the truth would leave them to the mercy of the bloodthirsty crowd waiting below. Directly beneath the inclined beams, townspeople brandished knives and weapons, chanting in unison for the prisoners to be released into their midst. Focusing his attention on Mayuko, he explained that the other prisoners had yielded no useful information regarding Yasuda, leaving her as his sole remaining source. Terrified by the threat, she frantically surrendered the information, revealing that she knew where Yasuda could be found. She claimed that Yasuda was establishing a new capital, but he demanded absolute clarity on the direction, pressing her to confirm whether it lay north or west until she insisted it was strictly to the north. Pleading desperately to be freed as her bound hands throbbed with pain, she specified that the destination lay a 10-day journey along the northern highway. Having extracted the necessary answers, he offered no clemency, snapping his fingers to signal that her suffering was only beginning. With a heavy mechanical thud, the wooden ramp lurched forward and tilted, sliding the screaming captives downward toward the eager mob below. Descending into the hostile crowd, she screamed out in confusion and agony, entirely unmindful of the past cruelty that had invited this retribution. She sobbed through her tears, demanding to know why such atrocity had been inflicted upon the townspeople, only for the hooded young man to coldly reply that it was simply because they were ugly before dismissing her despair. Enraged by the cold response, one of the bound captives spat venomous insults in defiance, sneering that without him, the hooded captor would hold top rank for sheer uselessness. Ignoring the outburst completely, the guards shoved the three helpless prisoners off the top of the stone stairs, sending them tumbling helplessly down toward the waiting crowd below. Hitting the ground heavily with agonizing groans, the fallen captives looked up in horror as dark, vengeful silhouettes began surrounding them. A grieving woman among the mob stepped forward with a sharp blade in hand, her face twisted in sorrow as she softly mentioned the kind husband who had been stolen from her. Driven by sheer grief, she plunged her knife deep into the captive's back, screaming demands for her son's return while the victim howled in unbearable agony. The violence escalated instantly as the rest of the enraged crowd descended upon the prisoners, hacking and stabbing mercilessly while howling demands to have their lost families restored. High above the carnage, the hooded orchestrator watched the brutal retribution unfold in silence, while a terrified young woman at his side shrieked in horror at the slaughter. Within moments, the captives lay motionless in pools of their own blood, reduced to mangled corpses as the cold-hearted onlookers casually discussed the brutal fate of the former oppressors. Returning his focus to the remaining captives cowering nearby, the cold leader casually prepared to proceed with his ruthless sentence. He turned his cold gaze toward the next bound prisoner, who began blabbering hysterically, offering crude and pathetic excuses in a desperate attempt to save his own skin. As the captive babbled on, trying to dismiss his previous taunts as harmless banter and insisting he was not truly creepy, the hooded figure listened in unsettling silence. Revealing a chillingly twisted expression under his hood, he leaned in closer, causing the captive to shriek in sheer terror as his cold words echoed back at him. Pointing out the flaw in the prisoner's own twisted logic, he reminded the whimpering boy that by his own standard, worthless and creepy beings deserved no mercy, standing beside the fresh blood of the previous victims. Ignoring the captive's frantic denial, he brutally kicked the bound student backward, casting him straight down into the waiting crowd below. With a heavy thud, the terrified youth crashed onto the hard ground before the assembled townspeople. Scrambling back on his knees, the desperate prisoner begged for his life, frantically promising to hand over endless gold, jewels, or whatever wealth they demanded if they would only spare him. Unmoved by his pathetic bribes, the village women stepped forward in grim, silent unison. Surrounding him closely with pitchforks and scythes held high, they coldly declared that the only payment they required was his life. In a violent, mob-driven fury, they struck him down, his agonized screams drowning under a rain of fatal blows. Bound tightly upon the wooden frame, Mayuko squirmed in terror as the hooded man prepared to continue his ruthless questioning. She desperately pleaded for her release, claiming she had answered enough, but he coldly demanded to know more about the full extent of Yasuda's powers. Struggling against her ropes, she insisted that she was completely in the dark regarding those secret abilities. She argued that several of their classmates actively concealed their true strength, though he challenged her logic by asking why her detection abilities had failed. Maintaining his grim silence, he listened as she admitted that search skills were useless against a target whose level was far too elevated. Shifting his focus, he brought up the deliberate fire at his family home and demanded to know her exact role in the plot. She weakly tried to deny her involvement, but his sharp, unforgiving glare instantly cut off her excuses. When he placed his hand on the release lever and threatened to drop her into the abyss, she panicked and agreed to confess. She recalled the day of the incident, when a group of classmates had arrived at his doorstep under the pretense of delivering a box of cream puffs as a get-well gift. As the box was opened, she admitted the sinister truth. The treats had been secretly laced with drugs to render the household helpless. She wept desperately, swearing that she had only used sleeping drugs on the family, but her interrogator screamed in grief over his lost sister, refusing to accept her excuses. Beneath the elevated platform, the vengeful crowd surged, their unified chants for her death echoing through the hall as sweat beaded on her brow in sheer terror. Terrified of her impending doom, she shrieked in desperation, only to glance sideways and freeze as a sinister, monstrous grin caught her attention. Suddenly, a loud cry rang out from the crowd, pointing toward the platform and warning everyone that monstrous orcs had invaded their midst. Seizing the distraction, she taunted the crowd with wild defiance, claiming that if they spared her, she would destroy the invading beasts before they could slaughter everyone else. Her bold outburst sowed immediate discord among the onlookers, leaving the agitated mob whispering in confusion as they pondered her warning. As the crowd wavered, a subtle smirk crossed her face, matching the mysterious grin of the hooded figure nearby. Before the mob could react, the hooded figures threw off their disguises, revealing powerful beasts on stage alongside a young man who stepped forward into full view. Standing tall before the stunned audience, he shouted out a bold challenge, demanding to know who their true hatred was directed against. The crowd stood paralyzed in confusion, torn between their rage toward her and the sudden, overwhelming threat posed by the surrounding monsters. He stood on the execution platform as the angry mob chanted Mayuko's name in unison, their deafening cries demanding retribution. Hearing the crowd's roar, she stared at him in utter disbelief, recognizing the very classmate she had despised back at school, now commanding the orc she loathed. Tears streamed down her face as the horrifying reality sank in, shattering whatever composure she had left. He calmly confessed that he had lied to her all along, confirming her worst fears about his hand in her downfall. Driven by cold malice, he violently shoved her against the wooden pillar, cutting off her desperate cries as she wept in agony. Moments later, a stark system display announced a grim objective: kill everyone, noting that 26 targets remained. On the stage above, the executed bodies hung bound to wooden posts while grief-stricken citizens vented their rage, denouncing their former protectors as nothing more than a plague upon the city. Walking away from the wooden scaffold, he descended the stairs flanked by giant orcs. The eyes of the stunned crowd locked onto him in tense silence. As they reached the foot of the stairs, one of the massive creatures leaned over to ask if the task was completed to his satisfaction. Aware that humans viewed his allies as nothing more than vermin, he quietly resolved that he would not perish until every single member of his class was dead, ready to fight his way out if forced. He watched as a massive crowd gathered beneath the wooden platform where Hirota stood between two towering guards, the spectators raising their hands toward the stage in desperate anticipation. The townsfolk fell to their knees, begging Hirota to save them and imploring him to slay the so-called heroes who had brought ruin to their lives. Voices called out from every direction, pouring their hopes into him and urging him to strike down Yasuda once and for all. Listening to the overwhelming chorus demanding death for the former heroes, he froze in shock, his wide eyes reflecting the sheer intensity of their mob zeal. His mind flashed back to the endless torment he had suffered at school, where his classmates had stood over him like monsters, callously deriding him as nothing more than livestock. Never in his entire life had anyone looked at him with anything other than utter contempt or cruel amusement. He remembered forcing himself to swallow scraps off the ground while they laughed at his degradation, treating his agony as a sick form of entertainment. Yet now, standing high above the thronging masses, he thrust his arm into the sky, feeling a sensation he had never experienced before. With a surge of exhilaration, he threw his voice across the square, rallying the mob to hunt down and eliminate the hero. Tears welled in his eyes as a euphoric smile broke across his face, overwhelmed by the intoxicating revelation that he was finally being treated as a human being. With his rally inspiring the town, the citizens eagerly assisted the young commander in preparing for his journey toward Yasuda's territory, mapping out the enemy's organizational structure. He oversaw the construction of defensive traps along the perimeter, determined to secure the settlement before leaving. Working alongside them, the massive orcs used their immense strength to hoist colossal boulders and dig deep pits in record time. They watched the grueling labor in astonishment, whispering among themselves in wonder while still questioning if one man could defeat all the heroes. Their lingering doubts began to fade as townspeople approached the gentle giants directly, sharing peaceful moments with them. They even watched in awe as children played happily around the armored behemoths, proving that the old prejudices had truly vanished. He smiled warmly at the harmonious scene, feeling a genuine wave of long-lost happiness fill his heart. Far from this peaceful town, harsh shouts echoed through a gloomy courtyard where overseers drove overworked captives to their limits. They ignored the desperate cries of a captive being brutally whipped, as a sinister figure observed the suffering silently from a high, arched window. He stood within his grand chambers with a look of utter disdain, dismissing everyone in both worlds as useless incompetents. He stood gazing out the high window with cold calculation, noting the lack of recent reports from the neighboring town before commanding a subordinate to investigate and prepare the inhabitants for discipline. As the brutal two-day deadline hung over the region, victims fell under the scorching heat, underscoring the relentless cruelty of the regime. 2 days later, before the sturdy walls of the fortified settlement, Hirota stood outside the main gates, feigning excitement to announce the arrival of a self-proclaimed hero. The gates opened to reveal Hifumi Uchida, an arrogant third-year classmate who sneered upon recognizing the familiar face waiting outside. He immediately began mocking his peer, deriding him for lacking skills and remaining at the bottom of the hierarchy even in this new world, before demanding to be led straight to Tsudama. Enduring the insults without a word, the young guide turned and led the arrogant intruder beneath the massive stone archway of the town gate. As he crossed the threshold, his eyes caught sight of something unusual hanging directly overhead, a colossal boulder bound tightly with heavy ropes. High above on the battlements, waiting defenders severed the thick ropes with heavy axe blows, springing their trap. He scoffed at the falling stone in disbelief, completely failing to move as the massive weight plummeted toward him with lethal velocity. The giant stone crashed down with crushing force, pulverizing the intruder instantly as the townspeople and Hirota erupted into ecstatic cheers of victory. He had designed a ruthless double trap, combining a heavy falling boulder with a concealed pit beneath to ensure complete destruction. Because of this cruel design, anyone who managed to survive the crushing weight would plunge onto lethal stakes, only to be paralyzed by electric eels below. Staring down at his work, his face grew tense with grim determination as he braced himself for what was to come. Gathering the townspeople and giant allies around him, he rallied their spirits, insisting that a coordinated ambush could defeat those who mocked their world. But before they could act, a sudden, blinding strike tore through the air, violently obliterating the massive warrior standing right beside him. As the fallen ally dissolved into dust, a brilliant hail of glowing light burst across the sky above the fortress wall. Descending with blinding speed, the lethal shower of energy arrows plunged straight toward the helpless crowd below. The devastating bombardment tore through the town square, sending terrified citizens scrambling as they realized with horror that a hero's magic was raining upon them. Amidst the rising smoke and carnage, he frantically bellowed for everyone to seek shelter behind the stone buildings. Despite his warning, agonizing screams echoed through the courtyard as the relentless barrage crushed all resistance under a storm of light. His teeth clenched in sheer anguish as he watched the unrelenting barrage tear through the town, desperate cries echoing through the smoke. A catastrophic rain of deadly projectiles descended without warning upon the courtyard, shattering the peace in an instant. Hirota recoiled in absolute shock, crying out in terror as he watched the unrelenting blitzkrieg obliterate the surrounding stone structure. During the ferocious barrage, a loyal beastman threw himself into the line of fire to shield the boy, suffering a devastating blow in the process. He scrambled over to his fallen defender, asking frantically if he was all right, only to be met by the creature's agonizing final grimace. With a heavy groan, the monstrous guard collapsed, leaving the youth utterly defenseless amidst the carnage. Panic gripped him tightly as he backed away from the dying warrior, his face contorted in disbelief and helplessness. Moments later, a second explosive shockwave tore through the entryway, crumbling the grand archway into jagged fragments. He raised his hands in futile defense, screaming at the top of his lungs as the world dissolved into fire and dust. Once the dust finally settled, nothing remained of the settlement except a vast field of smoldering, leveled ruins. Sitting numbly amid the stone debris, he looked around at the unimaginable devastation, whispering in tortured grief as he struggled to comprehend why this catastrophe had occurred. A faint rustle among the nearby rocks suddenly caught his attention, breaking the eerie silence of the wasteland. A wounded soldier clad in battered armor was painfully dragging himself across the ground, spewing venomous insults through clenched teeth. Gasping for air, the injured enemy grumbled to himself, realizing that the unexpected, devastating bombardment had been masterminded by Yasuda. He cursed under his breath, wondering if his own forces had launched the assault prematurely before the sun reached its peak. Hearing the soldier mention the mastermind behind the slaughter, Hirota was overcome with incandescent rage. He leapt to his feet and charged recklessly at the helpless enemy, screaming in fury as the wounded warrior panicked at his approach. However, his vengeful sprint came to an abrupt halt as his clothes caught tightly on sharp remnants of the wreckage. As he struggled desperately to tear himself free, a high-pitched, piercing whistle echoed ominous warning sounds across the ruined landscape. He wandered through the dense, silent forest, his heavy footsteps crunching against the overgrown brush as he searched for any familiar landmark. He had lost all track of time since fleeing the destruction, having run blindly without any idea of where he was or how to find the orc village again. Reflecting on the disaster, he realized how foolish it was to believe that pairing human strategy with orc strength could triumph against overwhelming martial power, especially when he possessed no special abilities of his own. A crushing sense of guilt washed over him as he remembered the fallen, knowing that the only beings who had ever truly accepted him had been slaughtered in his reckless quest for revenge. Staring into nothingness, tears streaming down his bruised, swollen face. He mocked his own hideous appearance and cursed the agonizing weight of his mistakes. Lost in his self-loathing, his foot unexpectedly snagged on a thick tree root, sending him tumbling violently down the forested slope with a startled yelp. Groaning in pain as he sat up in a small clearing, he suddenly froze when a faint rustling noise sounded from the surrounding foliage. Emerging from the shadow of the trees stood a majestic elf warrior wielding a bow, who demanded to know if he was human or orc before her eyes locked onto a discarded necklace lying near him. Recognizing the ornament, her cold posture softened into solemn surprise as she realized he was the person who had avenged Kataki and brought back the lost item. She revealed that Corellia had spoken fondly of a human named Takashi, leaving him bewildered to hear himself referred to as a human rather than an abominable monster. He listened in stunned silence as the elf archer spoke of Corellia. She revealed that Corellia had always insisted he was a good person, even expressing a desperate wish to learn the human tongue just so she could speak with him directly. As he processed her words, the warrior added that she had repeatedly warned Corellia against forming ties with humans, yet Corellia had stubbornly refused to listen. Memory stirred painful sorrow within him, recalling Corellia's warm, radiant smile as she called out his name, a memory that now tore through his broken heart. Breaking the emotional quiet, she introduced herself as Lagoda, the warrior chief of a nearby elf village, prompting him to offer a quiet, remorseful apology. Sitting together beneath the towering trees, Lagoda clarified that her knowledge of the human language was not out of goodwill, but a tactical necessity learned to anticipate an opponent's moves in combat. Looking down at his open palm, he held up Corellia's necklace and asked for directions to her grave so he could leave the keepsake there. But Lagoda urged him to hear her out before making his journey. Terrible images of violence and despair filled her narrative, recalling how the monstrous raiders had subjected her people to merciless abuse and agony. She pointed out the true ruler behind the invasion, Shinjiro Saito, a man known as the King of the Small, who had usurped control over the goblins after slaying 3 heroes, and she begged him to eliminate the villain and save her village. Details of Sato's ruthless barbarism, discarding broken victims to the mercy of wild beasts, drove home the desperation of her request, leaving him faced with a pivotal choice. He listened in grim silence as Lagoda described the horrific reality. Shinjiro treated the elves as mere bait, using their corpses to draw out beasts for his goblins to slaughter and feast upon. Continuing her grim tale, she emphasized that in the eyes of their tyrant, the elven people were nothing more than disposable toys. She reasoned that Shinjiro possessed a unique skill allowing him to command goblins, who routinely threw themselves in the path of her arrows to shield him, forcing her to beg for assistance. Her hands clenched into frustrated fists in the grass as she admitted that while she had defeated 3 enemies before with the help of orcs, she was now entirely helpless on her own. He gritted his teeth, agonized by his own weakness and lack of special abilities, admitting that his only intention had been to visit Corellia's final resting place. Gazing toward the peaceful ridge in the distance, she explained that she had laid Corellia to rest on that hill, but warned that approaching it now was impossible due to the goblins patrolling below. When he questioned why a grave was necessary, she revealed that while elven souls typically return to the forest naturally, Corellia's extraordinary nature required a proper burial. Recounting the day of the disaster, her tone darkened as she recalled returning from a routine trip away from the village, only to stumble straight into a living nightmare. Upon entering the shattered settlement, she was met with widespread destruction and rushed through the debris until she found Corellia collapsed on the bloodstained ground. Corellia lay severely battered and broken on the verge of death, leaving Lagoda completely overwhelmed by helplessness and grief. She listened intently as the dying Corellia made her final request, begging to be buried on the hill overlooking the settlement once she passed away. Continuing her feeble plea, Corellia wished for a tree to sprout from her resting place, allowing her spirit to watch over her beloved village and forest forever. As her consciousness drifted, vibrant memories flooded her mind, bringing back the joyful, peaceful days spent in the company of Takashi and their friends. Gazing toward the open sky, Corellia remembered fondly how beautiful that place was where she had shared so many priceless moments with Takashi. Momentarily, her hand slipped onto the cold earth as life left her body, leaving her companion silently kneeling over her lifeless form in the empty woods. Upon hearing that Corellia had called out his name in her final moments, Takashi reeled back in horror, his eyes wide with unbearable shock and anguish. Tears welled up and spilled over his face as he screamed her name in agony, while Lagoda solemnly recounted how deeply Corellia had loved the forest, the elves, and all living things. She added that Corellia had been adored by everyone around her in return, leaving Takashi sobbing uncontrollably as the weight of her loss crushed his heart. Switching her focus to revenge, Lagoda explained how she had mourned, learned of the necklace thief from survivors, tracked down a path of corpses, and finally identified the culprit controlling the goblins. Boiling over with fierce indignation at the senseless destruction of everything pure, she kicked at the earth and cursed the appalling cruelty of their enemy. She implored him to at least honor Corellia's memory by placing her necklace upon her grave if he held any love for her in his heart. With tears of desperation, she passionately begged him to help save the very village Corellia had cherished so deeply. He stood in heavy, troubled silence, prompting her to vent her bitter frustration at human passivity while desperately trying to formulate a plan. Looking each other in the eye, their shared grief solidified into a fierce, unspoken pact of determination. Before another word could be spoken, a sudden, sharp scream echoed through the dark woods, catching both of them completely off guard. Deep within a nearby clearing, Saito roared out his bitter frustration, cursing the cruel twist of fate that left him stranded in the countryside, unable to enter town with goblins and denied the lavish lifestyle he felt entitled to. Concealed behind the dense foliage, they watched in utter revulsion as the brutish young man cursed the goddess for condemning him to a life of being hated. Feeling somewhat relieved after his tirade, the arrogant intruder casually walked toward the bushes and began to relieve himself, completely oblivious to their presence right in front of him. Unable to contain his rage any longer, he burst from the thicket, roaring the villain's name at the top of his lungs and catching his enemy entirely off guard. With no time to spare, he bellowed for his companion to strike, and she instantly drew her bowstring taut, locking her aim onto their target. He led the surprise attack, charging forward while Lagoda's sharp arrows rained down upon Saito and his goblin underlings. Saito cursed violently, screaming at his minions not to die from a mere couple of arrows, but the barrage cut down the small creatures before they could react. Closing the distance in an instant, Takashi slammed his body full force into Saito, throwing the heavy man off balance and crashing him violently into the dirt. As Saito tumbled across the grass, Takashi stood tall over him, mocking the fallen bully and reminding him that his reign at the top was over. Standing on the serene grassy plain, Takashi declared with cold fury that the very spot Saito had casually defiled was the resting place of a life that had been cherished by all. Saito's face contorted in frantic rage, screaming that there was no place for Takashi in this world, refusing to yield to the classmate he despised most. Looking out across the hillside toward where Lagoda and the remaining goblins readied themselves for battle, Takashi proclaimed that right here beneath the sacred resting place, those who were hated by all would fight to the bitter end. With an unyielding glint in his eyes, Takashi braced himself for the clash, ready to settle their score once and for all. Saito snarled through grit teeth, realizing this brutal confrontation would finally decide who belonged at the very. Swarmed by a horde of foul creatures, the elven warrior swung her heavy staff with frantic energy, desperate to clear a path so she could assist her ally before it was too late. Meanwhile, a short distance away, the massive brute faced her companion in an open field, declaring that this battle would settle once and for all who belonged at the absolute bottom. With a loud taunt, he stood his ground with arms spread wide, mockingly inviting the young swordsman to land his best hit. Driven by sheer resolve, the youth charged forward with all his strength, only for his strike to be met and effortlessly blocked by the giant's overwhelming power. Cruelly overpowering his smaller opponent, the monster delivered a punishing sequence of blows while mocking the youth's utter lack of levels and skills. Gloating over the bloodied body, he reveled in the sadistic pleasure of violence, determined to make the helpless youth suffer as much as possible. Slumped upon the bruised grass, The wounded youth caught sight of a pair of luminous eyes gleaming from the dark, shadowy depths of the nearby forest. Recognizing a wild, desperate opportunity, he fixed his gaze on the creature lurking in the dark, deciding to make a reckless gamble for survival. Scrambling to his feet, he sprinted at full speed toward the shadowy tree line, leaving his attacker shouting in anger while his elven companion looked on in astonishment. He was taunted mercilessly as the bully demanded to see the power that had supposedly slain legendary heroes, while the elven warrior listened in disbelief, struggling to process the truth behind their captor's strength. Sinking to his knees under the relentless physical and verbal assault, the battered youth could only listen as his tormentor declared himself superior, sneering down at him like a useless swine. In a sudden surge of fury, the brute lunged forward, violently stomping the ground as he roared insults, convinced that he occupied the absolute top of the food chain. As the brute raised his weapon to deliver what he believed would be the final, humiliating blow, a soft, unexpected murmur of gratitude slipped from the fallen warrior's lips, catching his attacker entirely off guard. Looking up with a dark, chilling smile, the wounded youth reiterated his thanks for his enemy remaining alive, just as massive, towering monstrous forms materialized out of the shadows behind them. Before the arrogant attacker could comprehend what was happening, one of the massive orcs smashed into him with terrifying force, sending his weapon flying and knocking him violently to the dirt. Gasping on the ground in total shock at the sight of the colossal beast, the bruised bully could only stare in horror as his former victim stood calmly beside the monster, explaining that these orcs were the very allies who had tracked his scent to aid him. He further revealed his calculated strategy, explaining how he had deliberately lured the arrogant bully up the hill so his back would be turned completely toward the treeline where the beast lurked. Mocking the terrified brood on the ground by noting how well swine seemed to get along with one another, he watched as his former tormentor broke down completely, squealing in terror and frantically blubbering apologies. Kowtowing face down in the dirt with tears and snot streaming down his face, the completely broken bully begged pathetically for his life, claiming they were no different from each other, while the cold victor looked down on him without a shred of mercy. He pressed his face low into the grass, pretending to grovel in order to buy enough time for his hidden reinforcements to arrive. Watching the hulking orcs standing guard, he cursed silently, praying that his horde of goblins would arrive before his ruse was exposed. Desperate to maintain the facade, he began wailing hysterically, claiming he had only acted cruelly to protect himself from being bullied. As he spotted the goblin scouts creeping up behind his captors, a sinister smirk crept onto his face, believing his trap was about to spring. Springing up with sudden excitement, he ordered the monsters to slaughter the captors, only to thrust out his arm and discover his control ring was gone. Before he could comprehend what was happening, one of the goblins savagely clamped its jaws down onto his outstretched hand, causing him to scream in horror. Calmly watching the chaos unfold, the young avenger informed him that the magic gemstone maintaining his dominion over the beasts had been knocked off earlier. Clutching his wounded arm, the fallen brute foolishly attempted to reason with the bloodthirsty creatures, asking why they were turning on him after all he had given them. The goblin glared back with pure, unadulterated hatred, making him realize with sudden terror that the monsters held a deep grudge against him all along. The entire horde set upon him without mercy, leaving the young warrior to casually remark to his ally that the goblins harbored a far greater hatred for their former master than for anyone else. He looked on without a trace of pity, pondering which creature truly occupied the lowest depth of this world, a goblin or the monster cowering before him, before declaring the answer self-evident as Carolyn shrieked in terror. Beneath him, the bloated tyrant collapsed onto the dirt, pleading uselessly as the ravenous horde descended to tear him apart piece by piece. Drawing a final arrow under the cold light of the moon, the Avenger exacted ruthless vengeance for the slaughtered elves, systematically wiping out every last one of the oppressors. Sometime later, under a clear sky, the young warrior stood silently beside the elven maiden before a solitary wooden cross marking a makeshift grave. When she addressed him as their savior, he quietly requested that she refrain from using the title, though she maintained that he had genuinely rescued her village. Looking down at his own hand, he rejected any notion of heroism, confessing that he was nothing more than a vengeful killer consumed by hatred for those he had slain. He admitted that because the fallen heroine had radiated pure love, the exact opposite of his own dark nature, he felt unworthy to even draw near her resting place, until a sudden sound disrupted the moment. Sunlight bathed the peaceful valley beyond, illuminating the quiet settlement now freed from tyranny. Turning to him once more, the elven warrior reflected on how the world had embraced the heroes who arrived, even as their presence reshaped the land forever. She pointed out that while his quest for vengeance had diminished the number of self-proclaimed heroes, it was that very bloodlust that had ultimately ensured her village's survival. As he stood listening in quiet contemplation, the elven warrior declared her resolve to honor Corelia's memory by seeking to restore the world her fallen friend had once loved. Joining her cause, he acknowledged that while his own motivation stemmed purely from a personal grudge, their ultimate goals aligned perfectly in their shared quest to eliminate the so-called heroes. With a solemn determination etched across his face, he steeled his heart for the arduous path of vengeance that lay ahead. Standing beside his allies near a solitary tree on the barren landscape, he vowed that every strike of retribution would bring them one step closer to rebuilding the peaceful world that had been lost. Together with the elven warrior and their beastman companion, the unlikely trio stood united by shared loss and an unyielding commitment to their mission. As they set off across the open plains, they acknowledged their lack of power to save the entire realm, yet remained unflinching in their resolve to strike down their primary target, Yasuda. Far away in a grand palace, an arrogant nobleman contemplated the rising threat, dismissively reviewing reports of Takashi's actions and the demise of their beastly pawn. Looking down over a courtyard where enslaved captives were brutally drilled and disciplined, the nobleman doubted the intelligence claiming Takashi had slain several of their former classmates. Without hesitation, he unleashed a devastating barrage of destructive magic from above, obliterating the terrain below in a violent display of overwhelming force. Surveying the ruined battlefield strewn with debris, he cold-bloodedly condemned the land and its inhabitants as a worthless, hopeless world undeserving of salvation. He stood looking out from his balcony, wrapped in the belief that in this vast world, nothing and no one had true value except for himself. His eyes widened in a wild, unhinged glare, consumed entirely by a megalomaniacal fixation on his own absolute superiority. Following this display of arrogance, an official mandate was proclaimed across the realm. A formal suppression order was now active against Takashi Hirota. Far away from the recent skirmishes, news of Takashi Hirota's resurgence reached the upper echelons of power, as reports confirmed that the vengeful youth was actively hunting down his former classmates. A high-ranking noble issued a stern directive from his throne room, commanding his subordinates to subjugate the growing threat. He stared ahead with cold, uncompromising malice, explicitly reiterating his demand that Hirota be thoroughly exterminated without a second thought. Meanwhile, far from the noble's domain, the elven warrior conferred with her companions amidst the harsh mountain terrain. Realizing the sheer disparity in strength between their group and the formidable heroes, she openly admitted that a direct military confrontation was entirely out of the question. As her ally questioned how they could possibly counter the heroes given their weak force, Takashi proposed a cunning alternative strategy. He noted that their enemies had grown careless, suggesting they launch a surprise infiltration to steal the heroes' essential jewels rather than fighting head-on, even as his companion voiced concerns about potential informants who had compromised past ambushes. Exchanging a resolute look, she and Takashi agreed upon their next course of action and destination. Their gaze shifted toward the towering mountain range in the distance, where the secretive domain of the dwarves beckoned. As they journeyed toward the rugged dwarven territory, the elven warrior explained that although her people and the dwarves shared a tense history, the threat of a tyrant hero might unite them in common purpose. Traversing the desolate mountain pass, her companion offered to act as translator, knowing that his understanding of human speech would prove essential once they made contact. Upon arriving at the dwarven settlement, however, the travelers recoiled in utter disbelief. Dozens of dwarven warriors lay motionless, forced onto their stomachs in forced submission. Disturbed by this humiliating display, she rushed toward one of the fallen figures, urgently asking what calamity had befallen their people. Instead of accepting help, the prostrate dwarf growled in deep despair, bitterly telling the outsiders to leave them alone as their plight was none of their business. Refusing to abandon them in such a pathetic state, the elven warrior pleaded with him to break his silence and reveal the truth behind their torment. Softening under her persistence, the dwarf finally recounted how self-proclaimed heroes had descended upon their village, using a terrifying power of mind manipulation after taking the women and children hostage. In his painful memory, these cruel invaders had boasted of their absolute superiority, casting aside any pretense of heroism to reveal their true, sinister nature. These oppressors had forced the dwarven miners into grueling labor, demanding continuous deliveries of gold in exchange for the safety of their captive families. Concluding his grim tale, he revealed that whenever they were not mining, the hero's magical compulsion forced them to lie prostrate on the cold earth in absolute submission. She listened with a growing sense of dread as the scarred dwarf elder warned them of the brutal reality, declaring that anyone who dared to stand against the corrupt heroes would lose everything: their possessions, their eyes, and even their lives. Distraught, the chief pleaded for them to leave, but she revealed her own tragic past, sharing that her village too had once been subjugated by a tyrant wearing the mantle of a hero. Pointing to the silent young warrior beside her, she explained that he had slain that corrupt tyrant and freed her people from bondage. Disbelief washed over the dwarves, who murmured among themselves in astonishment, while the young warrior offered to eliminate the remaining heroes if they would allow it, though the dwarves worried whether their captive families were even still alive. Challenging their doubts, she urged the dwarves to take a stand, arguing that corrupt heroes would never keep their promises and that staying passive would only guarantee their destruction. Overcome with emotion, the dwarves bowed their heads to the earth, weeping openly as they begged the companions to help them destroy their oppressors and rescue their daughters. Heavy tears hit the cold stone floor as the chief clenched his fist in agony, surrounded by the desperate cries of his men yearning to see their wives again. Looking up through tear-filled eyes, the old chief begged them to save his daughter and grandson, a request the young warrior accepted with a firm and quiet promise before they set out. Approaching the rugged stone stronghold where the prisoners were said to be held, he observed that the perimeter was strangely unguarded. Peering inside the dim prison cell, their shock deepened as they found the vast holding area completely empty, leaving them to wonder what had happened to the hostages. He watched from the shadows as Sayumi Ito casually counted a pile of gold coins, callously boasting that even the last female dwarf had been sold off for a lucrative sum. Beside her, Sanae Yamashita crossed her legs nonchalantly, declaring that trafficking slaves would boost their bureau's influence and build an exclusive paradise for themselves. As Sayumi stretched lazily, mocking the male dwarves who still foolishly believed their families were hostages, the young warrior and his elf companion listened in rising fury from their hiding place. The two corrupt heroes burst into laughter, finding it hilarious that the desperate dwarves were working themselves to death in the mines for a rescue that would never happen. A grim vision of the sold captives flashed before them, innocent souls bound in cages, doomed to be displayed in freak shows or sold as playthings for wealthy nobles. With twisted, grotesque sneers, the women gleefully admitted that they cared nothing for the miserable lives they had destroyed. Hearing their heartless laughter, the hidden intruders trembled with overwhelming rage, their knuckles whitening as they struggled to restrain themselves. Unable to contain her disgust any longer, the elven hero stepped forward and cursed the evil pair, declaring that their vile deceit made her physically ill. As she condemned their cold manipulation of people's hearts, a painful parallel struck the young man, reminding him of how manipulative women had ruined lives through deceit in his former world. He recalled the nightmare of his past life on a crowded train platform, where high school girls had maliciously framed an innocent man, realizing that these corrupt heroes were the exact same evil in another form. He hesitated, sweat dripping down his face as he told himself not to interfere, terrified of what the malicious girls might do if he drew their attention. Nearby, Sanae Yamashita and Sayumi Ito aggressively cornered an innocent man, shouting false accusations and claiming he had touched Sanae with his hands despite his desperate denials. Amidst the rising commotion, A quiet classmate noticed the young student standing in hesitation, calling out his name just as she prepared to step forward herself. Stepping directly into the confrontation, the brave girl testified to the station staff that the accused man had been holding onto the overhead strap the entire time, proving he could not have touched anyone. Caught off guard, the accusers instantly shifted their story, furiously claiming the man had pressed against them instead, but the alert station guard quickly caught the glaring contradiction in their changing story. Realizing their deception was unraveling under scrutiny, the girl was forced to offer a rigid, formal bow of apology, clicking her tongue in silent frustration. She immediately put on a theatrical display of tears, feigning distress and claiming she had simply panicked during her first time experiencing such an ordeal. With the station official accepting the tearful performance as an honest mistake, the falsely accused man walked away relieved, leaving the young student to watch in stunned silence. Beneath their weeping facade, the two girls exchanged sinister, shadowed glances of pure malice directed at the classmate who had dared to expose their lies. Horror surged through him as he witnessed the chilling, monstrous truth concealed behind their innocent masks. He remembered how, just a few days later, a strange absence hung over Class 3B as the dark scheme unfolded. Inside the classroom, a girl suddenly feigned distress, loudly announcing to everyone around her that her gym clothes were missing. Because of her commotion, whispers quickly rippled through the room as fellow students expressed disgust at the thought of a thief among them. Capitalizing on the rising tension, someone directed everyone's attention toward the back of the room, pointing out a suspicious bulge in the heavy coat hanging on the chair of their outcast classmate. Reaching into the jacket, another student dramatically pulled out the missing gym clothes, seemingly catching him red-handed. In response, the girls immediately accused him of the crime, leaving him utterly bewildered and shouting in disbelief. As the room erupted into outrage, he desperately tried to defend himself, pleading that he had no idea how the clothes had ended up in his pocket. Exploiting his vulnerability, the other girls joined in with baseless accusations, whispering that he had been leering at Sayumi and implying he was responsible for other recent thefts. Overwhelmed by the avalanche of lies, he screamed in agony, begging them to stop as the class recoiled in disgust. Standing before him, the girls glared down with cold, merciless malice, pelting him with cruel insults and declaring that his soul was as hideous as his face. He could only watch helplessly as the hallway erupted into commotion, the teacher arriving to demand an explanation just as the girls pointed their finger, loudly claiming Hirota had stolen the gym clothes. Desperate to defend his friend, the large youth cried out that the accusation was untrue, but the teacher ignored his pleas, seizing Hirota and ordering him to come to the office immediately. As they dragged him down the corridor toward the staff room, his friend chased after them in vain, while the scheming girls watched the unfolding disaster with quiet, malicious triumph. They admitted their true motive with sickening calm, explaining that he was being punished simply for intervening when they had previously attempted to frame another innocent student with false claims of molestation. Cast down into darkness, he bowed his head, unable to escape the crushing weight of the trap that had been set for him. From that day onward, every missing item in the school was pinned on him, isolating him entirely until no one was willing to listen to his voice or believe his innocence. The scandal reached his home, involving law enforcement and tormenting his mother and sister, ruining their lives just as these same women now sought to corrupt this new realm with their deceit. His face twisted into a mask of pure, unadulterated fury, his eyes bloodshot as he swore an unbreakable vow that he would never forgive them for what they had done. Returning to the present beneath the twin moons, he analyzed the intelligence gathered from their allies, confidently declaring to his companions that they now understood the enemy's abilities and would emerge victorious. High up in the craggy mountains, the stone fortress stood silent in the cool night air, awaiting the inevitable battle to come. Inside the mountain fortress, Sayumi and Sanai decided it was time to turn in for the night, blissfully unaware of the impending breach. As she reached out to grab the heavy door handle, a strange commotion outside made her pause in suspicion. Before she could investigate further, the entrance shattered violently inward, throwing her to the stone floor as Takashi and his allies forced their way into the room. Reeling from the blast, She gaped in horror as she recognized her former classmate leading the raid alongside the elven warrior and their formidable allies. Seeing the threat, Sanai immediately unleashed her skill, pulling an object from afar directly into her hands, leaving Takashi to curse as he recognized her thief-like technique. Desperate to shift the odds, the young woman shouted commands to call the dwarves from the mines, seeking to provoke a chaotic clash. In response to her attempt, Takashi closed the distance in a flash, striking her down with a decisive blow that sent her crashing to the ground. Holding out a sack containing gathered hair, he coldly explained that he was already well aware of her insidious power to manipulate anyone simply by touching a piece of their body. Furious at the revelation, Sayumi gritted her teeth in rage, realizing that the demi-humans had leaked the secret mechanism of her absolute control skill. Cornered inside the shattered room with her companion defeated, she found herself completely surrounded by Takashi's forces with nowhere left to run. She felt the chill of Takashi's gaze as he leveled his weapon, coldly asking if they were finally ready to face retribution. Beside her, Sanai gritted her teeth in silent frustration, both women acutely aware that they were trapped with nowhere left to run. But beneath the shadows across her eyes, a sinister smile spread across Somi's face as a desperate plot took hold. In a sudden flash, Sanai activated her skill to snatch the staff right out of the party's hands, startling everyone as the weapon vanished and materialized in her grip. From the stolen weapon, Sanai retrieved a single strand of Carolyn's hair and handed it over, allowing Sayumi to channel her mind control magic directly into it. With the strand secured in her grasp, Sayumi declared that the tables had turned, throwing the entire group into sudden dismay. Glaring wickedly at Carolyn, she invoked her skill's absolute authority, commanding him to gouge out his own eye as punishment for standing in their way. Bound completely to her dark magic, Carolyn's body moved against his will, his fingers digging mercilessly into his own socket as blood splattered onto the ground. Screaming in ungodly agony, the massive warrior ripped his own eyeball free, holding the gory mass in his trembling hands while blood streamed down. Agony echoed across the barren landscape as Sanai clutched her bloodied face, her frantic screams ringing out while Takashi observed her despair without a sliver of sympathy. As she wept in unbearable pain, he calmly explained his strategy, revealing how he had used strands of hair to draw the roaming monsters directly to their path. Stunned by his cold calculation, she trembled as he pointed out how easily she had fallen into his trap, leaving her utterly horrified by what he had done to her. Overcome with fury, she lashed out at him, screaming insults as she lunged forward in a desperate fit of rage. But before she could reach him, the massive brute Carolyn intervened, violently seizing her with crushing force as Takashi looked on unbothered. With the target subdued, the group prepared to relocate, leaving the rocky terrain behind under his silent direction. Darkness soon fell over the mountainous landscape as they reached a secluded stone structure built into the hillside. Inside the dim shelter, she slowly regained consciousness, groaning softly as the grim reality of her captivity settled in. Outside, crude wooden structures and tied ropes stood anchored among the rocks, hinting at the meticulous preparation behind their capture. As consciousness slowly returned, Sanai opened her eyes to find Takashi towering above her in the bright daylight, his expression devoid of pity as he noted her awakening. Sanai whimpered in agony, clutching at her bleeding face as the intense pain began to settle in. Nearby, Sayumi gasped in terror, her voice trembling as she called out her friend's name upon witnessing her gruesome injuries. Panicking, the captive girls shouted out, demanding to know what cruel fate awaited them. Jewel turned toward Takashi, quietly asking what steps they should take next with the prisoners. Before Takashi could answer, the scarred dwarf chief stepped forward accompanied by his muscular kinsmen, each heaving massive, jagged rocks into their hands while declaring that the hour for dwarven vengeance had finally arrived. Sayumi paled instantly, recoiling in sheer horror as the blind eye of the dwarven elder glared down at her with unfiltered rage. The chief gestured toward a row of wooden stakes driven into the dirt, explaining bitterly how their organs, ears, and eyes had been repeatedly harvested and stolen from them over time. Sanai screamed desperately for mercy, begging them to stop as the dwarves gathered large boulders matching the exact weight and size of what had been stolen, carefully binding the stones within a heavy rope net. With a sudden, crushing release, the wooden rig snapped into motion, pulling the ropes taut and hoisting the screaming captives violently along the timber posts. The dwarven workers watched stolidly as the counterweight rocks dragged the heavy machinery down, telling the shrieking women to save their breath. Standing shoulder to shoulder, the dwarves declared that after enduring endless suffering under impossible demands, they were now delivering the full payment of retribution that had been earned. As the dwarven chieftain watched over the brutal ordeal, Takashi instructed his elven ally to exercise utmost caution, urging her to rely strictly on her magical skill rather than touching their dangerous captive directly. Holding up the shimmering pendant recovered from Sayumi, he noted that despite Latiga's extensive investigation, this singular jewel was all that had been found. Because direct touch was far too risky, he used a long staff to probe the captive, drawing an outraged scream from the bound girl who denounced his methods as utterly foul. Yet he remained unbothered, sternly demanding to know the name of the slave trader to whom the dwarves were sold. With the slaver's identity finally extracted, action was swift, and a rescue squad composed of healthy dwarven warriors alongside a formidable orc set out immediately toward the trader's location. As the expedition departed, he remained behind, his expression darkening as quiet contemplation took hold. Reflecting on his primary enemy, he realized that although details regarding Yasuda were scarce, a formal subjugation order had been placed on him, proving that his adversaries were actively hunting him down. Turning his stern glare back to the suspended captives, he delivered his final interrogation, demanding to know their exact involvement in setting his home on fire and causing his sister's death, though both women vehemently protested their innocence regarding the flames. Refusing to believe their desperate denials, he shouted at them to stop lying and reveal what Yasuda had said to them right before the fire. Just as the brutal dwarven counterweight jerked the screaming girl into the air once more. Broken by the relentless torment, she surrendered completely, crying out that she would speak and reveal everything they had been instructed to do. As her mind drifted back to a fateful memory of walking home with Mayuko and their classmates. In that recalled moment, she had innocently approached Mayuko in front of the others, asking if this was the way to her home with calculated deception. She stood among her schoolmates in the flashback, listening intently as they discussed rumors of a truck carrying hazardous materials that had allegedly crashed nearby. As the students deliberated posting news of the incident online for attention, the girl took control of the conversation, reminding them that the teachers had explicitly ordered everyone to return home immediately and remain indoors. While the group agreed to head home and watch the news coverage, Mayuko stood apart, taking the warning to heart and preparing to lock herself inside her residence. Watching from down the quiet street, the scheming duo observed as their naive classmate walked up to her front door without a shred of suspicion. Once the unsuspecting girl stepped inside and slid her front door firmly shut, the trap was officially set. Outside, the mastermind congratulated herself on how effortless the deception had been, confident that their target would not dare leave her house after hearing such a terrifying rumor. Her companion, however, began to show signs of hesitation, confessing that even though they were acting on Yasuda's direct orders, her conscience was heavy with guilt over what horrible fate awaited the innocent sister. Overcome with remorse, the hesitant accomplice turned around, insisting that they must hurry back to warn the girl to flee, only to be met by a cruel, mocking snicker from her partner. Bursting into hysterics, the ruthless strategist laughed off any notion of mercy, making it abundantly clear that she felt absolutely no pity for the victim. Turning the horrific plot into a twisted game, she gleefully raised her hand to challenge her anxious companion with a quiz about what cruel fate Yasuda had in store for their helpless victim. She began listing horrifying options like a game, assigning arbitrary points to acts of escalation, from graffiti and throwing food scraps to hurling smoke bombs through shattered windows. With a chillingly cheerful smile, she declared the grand prize would be burning the house to the ground with their victim inside, a twisted goal that her companion enthusiastically confirmed. As the girls stood casually in their school uniforms, their indifferent attitude made it clear that no matter how horrific the outcome, they felt completely detached from any guilt. Dark, Sinister grins stretched across both of their faces as they openly admitted to eagerly anticipating the cruel spectacle about to unfold. Back in the present, Takashi's rage reached a boiling point as the captive girl protested in panic, claiming they were merely following Yasuda's instructions and never foresaw a lethal fire. He suddenly grasped the calculated cruelty behind Yasuda's actions. The tyrant had deliberately engineered the situation to guarantee Fumina remained trapped inside her home. Recalling the memory of his former classmates standing together, the full scope of the plot dawned on him. Yasuda had systematically turned the entire class into unwitting accomplices. His gloved fist clenched until his knuckles strained, realizing that because responsibility was diffused among everyone, no one gave a damn about Fumina's life or death. Dangling helplessly in sheer terror, the young women shrieked and pleaded for mercy, desperately insisting they had answered every single question and confessed everything. Desperate to avoid his retribution, they begged the silent avenger to lower them, offering to assist him in hunting down and killing Yasuda. He glared down at them, his eyes wild with cold fury, entirely unmoved by their frantic pleas for mercy and promises of usefulness. Silencing their desperate cries, he snapped at them to shut their mouths, calling them out as the deceitful liars they were as they hung bound and helpless on the wooden racks. Turning his back on them, he coldly noted that had they not fed lies to Bunna, she might have actually survived. The weight of their deceit had brought nothing but endless suffering, pain, and destruction to countless innocent lives who trusted them. Offering them no forgiveness, he presented the bound girls to the vengeful dwarves as their long-awaited reward, ignoring the horrified screams of terror that erupted from the victims. As the agony unfolded, he stood silently alongside the dwarf chief, listening to the ragged, painful gasps of the punished women. Bound tightly to the rack, the woman's vision blurred with tears and pain as her breath caught in her throat, wondering if the crush of weight had finally ceased. Looking back down at her stretched and broken frame, he coldly corrected her, observing that the sensation had only changed because her limbs were now completely distended. Directing her tear-filled gaze toward the barren landscape, he asked if she could see the crude grave markers standing in the distance while she shrieked in unbearable torment. Surrounding those stone markers were the silent testimonies of all the laborers who perished from cave-ins, accidents, and reckless overwork under her cruel exploitation. Her agonizing screams offered no salvation, only echoing the dwarf clan's own grim history of brutal forced labor beneath crushing, relentless boulders. Before another plea could escape her lips, the heavy stone dropped from above, crushing her beneath its immense weight with a sickening crunch. Watching her companion's violent demise, the surviving girl trembled in sheer horror as the young avenger turned his cold, uncompromising gaze onto her, declaring her next. Yet as desperate tears welled in her eyes, she felt a subtle shifting in her bindings. The ropes tied around her wrists began to loosen and slide against her wet skin. In a sudden pivot from despair, a cruel, sinister smirk crept across her face as her hand quietly slipped completely free from the restraints. Quiet, mocking laughter began to resonate across the clearing, startling the surrounding crowd as the tables unexpectedly turned. She openly sneered at her captors, mocking their desperation and sending a jolt of alarm through the young avenger. Launching into a barrage of vile taunts, she viciously mocked the dwarf elder about his dead sister, claiming she was nothing more than cheap dog food, which provoked the dwarf chief into an unbridled, murderous fury. As the enraged chief lunged forward to execute her, a sudden blinding radiance erupted from her torso as she triggered her hidden ability, Yes Man Ask. Bursting with triumphant malice, she revealed that the magical jewel was embedded directly inside her own body, leaving the young warrior and the dwarves frozen in absolute shock. She appeared to be touching no one, leaving her opponent baffled as to how her sinister ability could have possibly activated. Yet through the crimson trail of spilt blood dripping down her bindings, a subtle physical connection had already been established with the dwarf elder. Because the blood created a direct link, her power reached the chief instantly, and she snarled a vicious warning that any sudden movement would mean his immediate death. Bound by the sudden hostage situation, the young warrior could only grit his teeth in intense frustration, forced to stand down despite his boiling hatred. Her features warped into a hideous mask of unbridled rage and thirst for retribution as she shrieked that she would never forgive those who humiliated her. Exploiting her leverage, she commanded her magic to heal her severely injured arms while keeping everyone pinned under the threat of killing their chief. As glowing energy violently knitted her flesh and bone back together, her mind focused entirely on completing her gruesome self-restoration. With a bloodshot eye wide with madness, she vowed that absolute vengeance was the only outcome she would accept. Left powerlessly watching as she made her escape into the night, the young Avenger cursed his inability to finish what had started. In the days that followed, search parties combed the surrounding wilderness following her faint trail, but her scent eventually vanished without a trace. A young dwarf girl and her little brother cried out in pure joy upon spotting their father returning across the grassy field. Overwhelmed with emotion, the dwarf father collapsed to his knees and pulled both of his children into a tight, tearful embrace. As the young boy babbled excitedly about his journey to the big town, tears streamed down the father's face, immensely grateful that his family was finally whole again. Observing the emotional reunions from a short distance, the young Avenger noted that the negotiations with the slave traders had succeeded, allowing the vast majority of the captive dwarves to return safely to their people. The scarred dwarf chief stepped forward to address him directly, expressing deep gratitude from the bottom of his heart. Declaring the young man their true benefactor, the elder pledged the unwavering support of all dwarves whenever he might need aid, sealing the solemn promise with a firm, respectful handshake. With the agreement sealed, a roar of triumph erupted across the settlement as the entire dwarven clan raised their arms in unanimous celebration. Seeing their enthusiasm, he smiled with newfound confidence, knowing that having the formidable dwarves as allies would prove crucial in his upcoming conflict against his former classmates. Far from the joyful village, a stark contrast unfolded in the dark depths of the wilderness, where a bloodied and battered figure lay collapsed on the earth, her breathing ragged and shallow as life seeped from her broken body. Despite the agony tearing through her flesh, an overwhelming fury burned inside her thoughts, her hatred fixating entirely on the massive brute who had brutalized her. Her features twisted into a terrifying mask of pure malice, her bloodshot eyes wide with unhinged insanity as a monstrous vow echoed through her mind, swearing to butcher every single. Takashi and his allies gathered around a small campfire outside a cave entrance. A few days had passed since forming their pact with the dwarves, and as they sat discussing plans to bring down Yasuda, a sudden, violent vibration jolted the ground beneath them. Far off in the distance, a colossal blast erupted across the horizon, obliterating a vast mountain peak in a violent burst of smoke and debris that sent shockwaves tearing through the air. Miles away inside a grand fortress, the nobleman classmate stood amidst his subordinates, feeling the tremors reverberate through the stone hall as distant smoke billowed into the sky. He stared out the window in muted astonishment, observing the complete disappearance of the mountain and reflecting that even their formidable rival could not summon such staggering destruction. Leaving his bewildered followers behind, he stepped slowly toward the high arched glass to absorb the full scale of the distant ruin. Gazing out, he recalled a memory of a filthy cockroach he had once discovered inside a villa, a creature whose color, shape, and movement filled him with absolute, unadulterated disgust. Unable to tolerate its hideous presence, he had set the entire villa ablaze, burning the estate to the ground simply to ensure the insect was completely destroyed. His eyes widened with a chilling, unhinged intensity as he made the connection, feeling that same profound revulsion toward those he viewed as pests in this world. As his aides quietly suggested sending a search party to check for any remaining corpses, he agreed with cold indifference, continuing to gaze out into the smoldering horizon. He peers coldly through the heavy window frame, muttering under his breath as he contemplates sending scouts to inspect the distant blast site. Across the vast horizon, distant mountain peaks stand desolate beneath the lingering haze left behind by the catastrophic magic explosion. Far from the ruined mountain, subtle shockwaves fade into the quiet wilderness surrounding the hidden dwarven territory. Meanwhile, Takashi and his small band of allies trek across the grassy highlands toward a massive cliff face. Wondering about the incredible force of the explosion, the elven companion asks if it was Yasuda's destructive power, and the young warrior solemnly confirms it likely was. Relieved to have taken shelter in time, the group enters a cavernous dwarven stronghold carved deep into the side of the mountain ridge. Built a safe distance from the main mines, this vast multi-tiered cave system serves as their hidden base of operations to plan a counterattack. Holding a small pouch, he anticipates that enemy search parties will soon arrive to check for survivors, proposing they harvest venomous forest plants to craft deadly trap powders. He outlines the cold strategy further, explaining that once the poison incapacitates the intruders, they can interrogate and eliminate them one by one to whittle down the enemy's numbers. Before their plans can take shape, a blood-curdling shriek echoes from the lower depths of the cave, throwing the entire party into immediate alarm. He peered down over the edge of the rocky ledge alongside the dwarven chief and his companions, horrified to see several workers collapsing below, writhing in sudden agony. Shouting out in alarm, the elven warrior and the others called down to check on the fallen figures, frantically ordering anyone nearby not to descend into the lower levels. The afflicted workers gagged and shrieked, their hands clawing helplessly at their throats as violent spasms racked their bodies. Shocked by the gruesome sight, the group watched in disbelief as foam spilled from the victims' mouths, signaling the work of a lethal toxin. Realizing the grave danger, he bellowed for everyone to abandon the lower cavern immediately and head outside before the poison gas reached them. As they scrambled up through the narrow stone corridors, the party tried to make sense of the sudden attack, realizing the scent had been picked up first by those with heightened senses. Grasping the unnatural swiftness of the assault, the elven warrior wondered aloud if an enemy had unleashed a specialized magical ability against them. Leading the charge toward the sunlight, he remembered the relentless hostiles among his former classmates, questioning why they would strike this location again so soon. With heavy steps echoing through the cavern doorway, the entire group burst out into the fresh mountain air to escape the deadly fumes. While calling on everyone to prepare for a possible ambush outside, his eye widened in sudden shock as he detected an unexpected threat lurking right ahead. As he emerged into the open field, the small animals in the grass scrambled in terror, sensing a sudden, looming shadow descending from above. Descending gracefully from the sky with a parachute apparatus, Shigeki Mitsuya of Public Security chuckled softly to himself, surprised to find that his target was still breathing while others had perished. Watching the airborne intruder float overhead, the dwarf elder cursed under his breath, realizing that all their ground defenses and hidden traps were utterly rendered useless. With effortless precision, Mitsuya touched down upon the terrain, bypassing every subterranean snare without triggering a single trap. A cold, triumphant sneer stretched across his face as he burst into mocking laughter, reveling in his complete upper hand over the helpless group. Looking down upon them from his vantage point, Mitsuya taunted that high above was the rightful place for someone of his stature, prompting Takashi to grit his teeth in fury and demand to know if he was behind the toxic strike. This overwhelming arrogance stemmed from his upbringing, rooted deep within the prestigious walls of Mitsuya General Hospital, one of the grandest medical institutions in Japan. Throughout his entire youth, rows of hospital staff would bow respectfully as he walked through the corridors, reinforcing his belief in his innate superiority. Born as the brilliant and wealthy heir to this vast medical empire, Mitsuya had grown up convinced that a glorious and flawless future was guaranteed for him. However, that unworried confidence shattered in an instant the day he stared at the published exam results, confronted by an unexpected reality that threatened his self-proclaimed perfection. He had failed to gain admission into his chosen high school, his fist trembling violently as he crumpled the official rejection letter displaying his disappointing score. Forced to enroll in what he viewed as a bottom-tier school, he sat bitterly at his desk as graded exams were handed back to the class. Staring down at his paper, his teeth ground together in fury upon seeing a dismal score of 34 alongside a patronizing note from the teacher. Refusing to accept the reality of his failure, he convinced himself that the instructor must have made a blatant grading mistake. His eyes then drifted to the quiet student seated next to him, who who was looking down at a paper marked with a perfect score of 100. The humiliating realization that he had lost to someone he deemed completely beneath him broke his composure, causing him to squeeze his test paper into a tight ball. Driven by sudden rage, he leaped out of his chair and slammed his hands down, screaming accusations of cheating at his startled classmate. He berated the timid boy relentlessly, calling him a coward while the classmate desperately stammered out his innocence. Even as the teacher ordered him to sit down and stop making a scene, his anger festered into deep, psychotic malice. With a sinister, vein-popping grin stretching across his face, he swore that such an insult to his ego was absolutely unforgivable. His cruel habit of tormenting those he deemed inferior manifested daily, leaving the helpless boy known as Pig staring in sheer terror at a pile of food dumped on the floor. As the terrified student cowered, the bullies invited the rest of the classroom to dump their own scraps onto the messy heap. Trapped in his humiliation, the poor boy listened silently as his classmates snickered and giggled at his miserable plight. Stepping forward with a sinister grin, the arrogant youth announced that the food alone was far too pitiful and insisted on adding some special medicine to make it complete. He then casually poured his own special blend of toxic chemicals directly onto the food, causing the surrounding students to react with a mix of squeamish disgust and cruel amusement. With a chilling smirk, he mocked them all by claiming he was merely following proper dosage instructions for the concoction. Leaning right into the trembling boy's face with a terrifyingly sadistic expression, he coldly commanded him to eat every single bite. As a result of this relentless pressure, the broken boy actually began consuming the poisoned slop, surrounded by the callous laughter and disdain of the entire room. Returning to the present conflict, Takashi suddenly understood the villain's history with dangerous chemical substances, realizing he had indiscriminately dropped toxic gas from his parachute, causing the surrounding vegetation and wildlife to wither and die. The arrogant strategist boasted that he had combined extracts from local poisonous plants and insects to create a heavy gas that would sink into burrows, efficient enough to wipe out Takashi and the demi-humans hiding underground, boasting proudly of his status as a hospital heir. As he floated down from the sky, the elven archer aimed her bow directly at him and loosed an arrow, but a sudden force struck back. The sudden gale caught her and her companion completely off guard, roaring around them as they struggled to maintain their footing. Reacting swiftly, she drew forth vials containing fire salamander fluids and red mushroom extract, preparing to unleash a countermeasure into the tempest. Flames erupted in a brilliant blaze across the clearing, but the floating intruder only scoffed, declaring that none of them would escape his reach. With a twisted grin, he activated his skill, controlled turbulence, manipulating the wind currents so that the roaring flames inverted and aggressively pursued the elven warrior. He gloated down at them, boasting that his wind manipulation was ideal for spreading chemical agents and dispersing flames, a power uniquely suited for someone inheriting a vast medical institution, while the companions cursed below in frustration. Gazing up at the descending adversary, the young Avenger gritted his teeth, swearing he would not allow history to repeat itself or let him flee again, though the officer merely dismissed him as a fool. That bitter declaration caught the officer's attention, bringing a dark, taunting smile to his face as he echoed the words with sinister amusement. A horrific realization struck the young man, flashing back to the horrifying day his family's home was consumed by fire while voices wept inside. Hovering above the stunned group, the officer revealed the gruesome truth with a wide, sadistic grin, confessing that he was the very monster who had torched his home to the ground. Descending smoothly from above on a specialized rig, Shigeki Mitsuya flashed a sadistic grin as he casually revealed to Takashi Hirota that he was the one who had set his family home ablaze. He boasted open-mouthed about how magnificent the flames had been, praising his own execution, while down below, Hirota grit his teeth in absolute fury as his companions looked on in horror. Overwhelmed by anguish, the young Avenger screamed up at the floating assailant, demanding to know the reason behind such a cruel and senseless atrocity. The operative coldly refused to offer any answers, taunting him while declaring that he was destined to burn to death just like his sister had. As destructive attacks rained down from above, the companions scattered in a desperate dash for survival. Hirota's mind racing as he scrambled to find a way out of the deadly barrage. He stole a tense glance back toward the tree line, watching as explosions tore through the foliage behind their fleeing party. Formulating a quick tactic, the young warrior directed the elven archer to draw their attacker's attention with a shot, to which she promptly agreed. Leading the group toward the cover of the woods, they sprinted together while the arrogant operative mocked their attempt to escape from high above. Noticing the archer taking aim at him from below, the floating operative clicked his tongue in annoyance right as the command was given to strike. He hovered high above the battlefield in his parachute rig, unleashing his wind skill to deflect incoming attacks, unaware that the dwarf chief below was hurling a massive boulder wrapped in a glowing sphere directly into the sky. As the projectile hurtled toward him, the arrogant officer scoffed, confident that such a crude attempt would never pierce his aerial defenses. However, the stone detonated into a massive cloud of poison powder in midair, leaving him coughing violently as the chaotic wind currents tangled his parachute lines beyond repair. Caught in the very vortex he had created, the young man plummeted helpless toward the forest floor, crashing violently against the hard earth. Lying paralyzed on the ground as the toxins took hold, he glared in disbelief at Hirota, who calmly stepped forward to explain how they had gathered poison traps throughout the forest and launched the powder above him. Gritting his teeth through the paralysis, the fallen adversary taunted that Hirota and his allies couldn't possibly have avoided inhaling the toxic dust themselves. Yet as he looked closely at the unscathed party standing at a safe distance, the doctor's son struggled to comprehend how they remained completely unaffected by the poison drifting in the air. Unable to accept his defeat, he screamed in desperation, accusing Hirota of cowardice and demanding to know why the venomous cloud had not fallen upon them as well. Hirota revealed his masterstroke, explaining that the massive updraft created by the officer's own flames had carried the poison upward and away from the group, leaving the humbled strategist horrified that his own magic had been weaponized against him. Before he could process the full weight of his humiliation, sheer terror seized him as he realized the surrounding brush and his own gear had caught fire, threatening to consume him while he lay helplessly immobile. Trapped by the advancing flames, the paralyzed agent squealed in sheer panic, desperately begging to be saved in exchange for information. As the young Avenger stood over him with an unyielding glare, he blurted out frantic lies, claiming he had not been the one to burn down the house. He continued to babble excuses, insisting he had merely supplied the fuel in a fit of rage and had lied about setting the blaze. Desperate to secure his rescue, he swore on his honor as a doctor's son that he possessed critical intelligence worth trading for his life. He revealed that a unique princess resided in the royal capital, a figure of supreme importance whose very existence held unusual secret value. Upon hearing that the transferred hero's unique skills were completely ineffective against this princess, the young warrior reacted with visible shock while learning she was currently held under house arrest by Yasuda. Satisfied that he had extracted all useful details, the young leader casually turned his back on the squirming captive while the fire continued to crackle nearby. He breathed a sigh of relief as the companions turned to leave, foolishly assuming his life was out of immediate danger. Before he could even celebrate his survival, the massive beastman seized him by the collar with a single oversized arm and violently hoisted him into the air. Flying through the air, he crashed violently down the rocky hillside, left groaning in agony far away from his captors. He gasped in pain and shock as Hirota casually turned his back, announcing that he had extinguished the fire before offering a cold farewell. Desperate not to be left behind, he pleaded for them to wait, screaming in panic about the deadly gas leaking around them while his former classmate nonchalantly kept walking. Pointing frantically to his severe injuries, he screamed for attention, begging to know how he was expected to survive in such a broken state. Hirota paused, indifferently questioning why the son of a doctor could not simply heal himself, to which he frantically countered that he possessed no medicine to treat his wounds. Standing over him in the desolate clearing, they pressed further, questioning why he had not been granted a healing skill if he came from a family of physicians. Carolyn chimed in with a cruel observation, mocking that even the goddess who bestowed their gifts must have recognized his lack of talent, deeming him unworthy of receiving medical abilities. A terrible grimace tore across his face as pure humiliation and anger boiled inside him. His jaw tightly clenched against the sting of their taunts. As Carolyn hurled vicious insults from above, deriding him as ugly, weak, and pathetic, he spat up blood, desperately clinging to his pride by whispering that he was superior, wealthy, and destined for better things. Sobbing uncontrollably and clutching his bleeding face as he cried out that he didn't want to die, he was met only with Hirota's indifferent wave goodbye as the Avenger finally walked away for good. With another rival left broken in the wilderness, the ominous system message updated the grim counter of the death game, announcing that only 23 participants remained alive. High above the realm, the central royal fortress stood encircled by massive stone walls and winding riverways, isolating the throne from the surrounding wilderness. Deep within those soaring spires, grand marble stairways led directly into the heart of the palace's inner chambers. Inside, attendants fruitlessly attempted to force spoon-fed rations against the lips of Princess Sarah Torvajarvi, who met their coercion with cold, unwavering defiance. Seated gracefully upon her throne, she made her stance explicitly clear, informing her captors that no matter how many times they tried, she would refuse to accept their meager alms. Her defiant rejection pushed the two women from the People Administration Bureau to their absolute limits, causing them to grit their teeth and click their tongues in mounting irritation. Unable to contain her rage, Miho Kinoma lunged forward and violently grabbed the royal gown, barking at the prisoner not to get ahead of herself. While Arika Akitagawa warned that their patience was wearing thin, the royal captive remained utterly unfazed, questioning whether they knew anything beyond brute force and pointing out that her death would ruin the heroes themselves. She laid down her ultimatum. Unless they guaranteed food, clothing, and proper living conditions for her people, she would starve herself to death, taking the secrets of special abilities to the grave and leaving them to face Yasuda's execution for their incompetence. As terror washed over the bureaucrats at the thought of Yasuda's wrath, a heavily armored young man named Hoshi Hikaru from the Education Bureau sauntered into the room with a cheerful greeting. Instantly abandoning their menacing postures, the two women swooned with hearts in their eyes, running to Hoshi to whine dramatically about how mean the princess was being to them. He acknowledged the anxious aides with an easy confidence, assuring them that he was well aware of the princess's renewed hunger strike and had brought a solution. Approaching the captive royal, he unveiled a metallic chalice filled with food, offering it to her with a mockingly polite presentation. Her eyes flared with outraged indignation as he leaned in uncomfortably close over her throne, completely disregarding her dignity to present the meal. Without waiting for her consent, he forcefully tipped the chalice, pouring the food directly down her throat and callously asking if she found it tasty as she choked it down. As she struggled to swallow the forced meal, the sudden, rasping laughter of Etsuo Kamiyama echoed through the hall, signaling the arrival of the repulsive official from the People Administration Bureau. The grotesque man shuffled forward with lecherous intent, completely ignoring the warnings and protests of the young administrative staff. When the intruder brazenly began unbuckling his trousers before her, she delivered a swift, forceful boot kick directly into his torso, sending him crashing backwards onto the stone floor. Undeterred by the violent rejection, he casually sat up, muttering sinister assurances that his power functions anywhere and at any time. He eventually ambled away with a deep sigh, leaving a heavy cloud of disgust lingering over the chamber. While the two female aides shrieked in revulsion over why such a foul creature was permitted inside the castle, their focus quickly shifted back to swooning over their handsome hero. She stood alongside her companion as Hoshi reassured them, explaining that Kamiyama's strange ability served a practical purpose under Yasuda's direct orders, promising to keep them safe. Turning back to Princess Sarah with a charming smile, he vowed to protect her too, though a chilling, possessive obsession lurked behind his gentle words. Meanwhile, several days had passed since the brutal clash with Mitsuya. Takashi and his companions discovered that the majority of the dwarves had escaped through a hidden tunnel, joining forces into a formidable army. In preparation for the impending siege, they gathered loyal allies, borrowed sturdy armor, and tasked the dwarf chief with forging specialized weaponry for the rescue mission. As the grand towers of the royal capital appeared on the distant horizon, Carolyn marched at the front of the column, driven by the burning urge to reach the princess before time ran out. Night fell over the land, casting twin moons' cold light over the sprawling royal castle, where an eerie, heavy silence pervaded the corridors. Deep inside the shadowy halls, Kamiyama slunk through the darkness, a twisted, sinister grin plastered across his oily face. Cornering the captive princess with a vile chuckle, he leaned close, causing Sarah to glare at him with utter disgust and rising apprehension. His filthy gaze undressed her torn gown, lingering greedily over her exposed chest and thighs as his depraved intentions became painfully obvious. Panting with grotesque anticipation and his tongue hanging out, the vile man lost all restraint, eager to claim his prize. He loomed below Princess Sarah with a sickening, wide grin, rationalizing to himself that even a fleeting taste of indulgence would be worth whatever mistakes he made, as his eager fingers reached out toward her helpless. High inside the opulent throne room, Kamiyama approached Princess Sarah with a sinister, frantic energy. Clad in his heavy fur-collared suit, he taunted her, gloating that despite explicit warnings from Hoshi and Yasuda to keep his hands off her, he felt entirely unconstrained by their orders. Unmoved by his brazen taunts, she looked down from her high seat with cold contempt. With quiet disdain, she declared that he was nothing more than a deeply pitiful creature, leaving him momentarily speechless. Her cold declaration struck him like a physical blow, breaking his arrogant posture into frantic, childish indignation. He recoiled in disbelief, shouting hysterically against the utter disgust written across her face and demanding that she stop looking at him with such contempt. Collapsed onto the floor, he could only stare up in stunned silence as the painful harshness of his reality hit home. The gap in their standing and the stark reality of his own lesser abilities left him entirely helpless under her unyielding gaze. Tears welled in his eyes as he was forced to confront the truth of his standing among the summoned heroes. His inferior capabilities had created an unbridgeable disparity, leaving him systematically oppressed by those he had once considered his equals. As he burst into helpless weeping, the heavy doors opened behind him to reveal Prince Hoshi entering in full armor. The knight sternly reminded him that he had been explicitly forbidden from entering the princess's chambers, sending a fresh surge of dread through the broken man. He cowered on the stone floor, stammering pathetic excuses while the prince stood over him, firmly reiterating that he had explicitly forbidden him from entering the princess's private chamber. Scuttling away down the grand hall with a frantic squeal, he fled the room as Prince Hoshi watched him depart with a weary sigh. The young prince turned back to the princess, softly checking if she was unhurt and reassuring her that she could rest peacefully before the upcoming parade. He threw his arms into the air with dramatic flourish, enthusiastically boasting about the public parade and how the citizens would adore seeing her for the first time in ages. His jovial demeanor vanished in an instant, replaced by a dark, threatening glare as he pointedly asked if she truly harbored no hatred toward the populace. Stunned by his sudden shift in tone, she stared at him with wide, frozen eyes, caught entirely off guard by the unspoken menace behind his words. Smoothly slipping back into a polite demeanor, he bid her good night, while casually suggesting she stop addressing the pathetic intruder with proper etiquette in the future. Far from feeling defeated, the delusional intruder scuttled through the corridors, misinterpreting the princess's harsh words as secret affection and convincing himself she was secretly in love with him. He drew a small blade and struck wild, manic poses in the hallway, shouting hysterically about his plans to claim both her virginity and the kingdom's ultimate power. Meanwhile, outside the city perimeter, Carolyn Pig and his band of beastmen stood quietly upon a grassy hill, gazing down at the sealed gates of the fortress. While he observed quietly from the back of the group, Takashi firmly rejected the idea of forcing their way through, warning that any loud commotion would instantly alert his former classmates. To slip past notice, two of their armored allies marched ahead into the forest, their heavy footfalls ringing softly through the trees. A call rang out to check on the pair designated as Waff and Doff as they pushed deeper into the woods to locate the secret passage. Relying on old dwarven wisdom, the party deduced that aristocrats always built subterranean escape routes, avoiding water veins to make tunneling easier. By narrowing down the geological possibilities, The underground inhabitants quickly pinpointed the exact location of the hidden entrance. Watching his newfound allies work with such cunning and unity, Takashi couldn't help but wonder why his former classmates looked down on these people as mere savages, ignoring their rich culture and individuality. With a low, grinding rumble, the armored vanguard lifted the heavy stone slabs that concealed the subterranean passage. Emerging into a quiet side alley, they confirmed they had successfully bypassed the city wall, though the path unfortunately stopped short of the castle itself. As the larger beastmen squeezed through the narrow exit, the elven warrior perked her ears, detecting faint, turbulent noises in the distance that human ears couldn't catch. Focusing her sharp senses on the distant commotion, her expression darkened as she picked up hushed, alarming whispers concerning Princess Sarah. She and her companions peered out from the alleyway, completely baffled by what they were overhearing. Takashi struggled to make sense of the commotion, unable to fathom why the princess would be out in the public streets, while the others pushed forward in disbelief. As the surrounding townspeople watched on in helpless horror and grief, the party finally saw the brutal truth with their own eyes. Shock and outrage washed over them as the agonizing reality set in. There in the open avenue, Princess Sarah was being subjected to ultimate degradation, forced onto all fours, and made to crawl through the cobblestone streets like a leashed animal, paraded before the helpless citizens by armed captors.